Section 1 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Abayi in January 2019. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Zoology. Chapter 1. Fabulous Zoology. The beginnings of zoology lie in the region of fable. In the earliest traditions and myths of primitive races, the world is peopled with men and animals, some real, some half-real, some entirely fabulous. Natural and supernatural are mingled together, and a religious or superstitious significance attaches to both real and unreal beings, seen or imagined by primitive man. His ready imagination and uncritical belief made the creations of his fancy seem as real as those of his observation and experience. With the increase of knowledge of the real, the unreal became more and more relegated to the domain of folklore and fable. Some of it has been preserved in the traditions and myths of different races, some crystallized in the fanciful animals of decorative sculptures, paintings, and heraldry. Most of it has been forgotten. It has been well observed that the imagination of man does not really enable him to create anything new, but only to recombine or rearrange what he has seen. He may combine the body of a reptile with the wings of an eagle. He may combine the head and shoulders of a man with the body and legs of a horse, or attach to a human form the white wings of a swan. He may in fancy enlarge a mouse to the size of an elephant, or conceive of a serpent large enough to encircle the whole world. He may support the universe upon the back of an elephant of appropriate size. But all these are not new creations. They are objects known to his experience, but recombined or altered in proportions. It is only as he comes to realize with wider knowledge that certain combinations of parts, certain relations of size do not occur in nature, that these imaginary beings become improbable or impossible. He is accustomed to supply the missing parts of half-seen animals from his previous observations. He sees the head of a deer projecting from the leafy wall of the forest, and all unconsciously pictures the rest of the quadruped from what he has seen before. He sees a distant eagle perched upon a crag and knows well enough that when it starts to fly, it will stretch out a pair of broad wings, now closely folded against the body and invisible in the distance. If then he sees dimly outlined in the clouds a human form, what more natural than to supply it with the long feathered wings that belong to the birds of the air? Or, if at night, with the wings of the bats that infest his cave dwelling. Nearly all of the fabulous monsters of zoology belong to this early period. They have been handed down conventionalized in form and degenerated into fable, but originally they were just as real as the rest of the half-seen, half-imagined world in which primitive man existed. Perhaps the most familiar and universally known of these fabulous animals is the dragon. It appears in all the older myths of the Western nations in a serpent form, usually winged, often with fiery or pestilential breath, the deadly enemy and scourge of man. It is equally prominent among the Eastern peoples, and probably received from them its conventional form, the long hind legs, the great eagle claws, the body covered with glittering armor scales, the writhing tail and bat-like wings. Among the Mediterranean nations, it appears first as a sea monster and comes up out of the sea. Wings were a later addition. In the northern myths, it is at first a worm, i.e. a serpent of gigantic size, and the conventional form is borrowed later from the east. The fabulous dragon had a real counterpart, singularly close in some respects, in the extinct carnivorous dinosaurs of the age of reptiles. These gigantic reptiles were not winged indeed, but in the proportions of body, limbs, and tail, in the huge head and sharp teeth, the enormous, sharp, eagle-like claws, possibly even in the glittery scaly armor, some of them at all events might have sat for a very tolerable portrait of the dragon of mythology. It is a tempting explanation to suppose that some tradition of these real monsters, handed down from primitive ancestors, was the basis of the dragon legends so widely scattered among all races of men. But this theory must be regretfully abandoned when the perspective of the geologic record is examined. The last of the dinosaurs became extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period, some 3 million years ago, at a moderate estimate, before the evolution of the various races of modern quadrupeds had begun, long before monkeys and apes had evolved out of the primitive lemur-like animals from which they are derived, and long, long before the evolution of man. The remote ancestors of the human race in the days of the dinosaurs were tiny, shrew-like animals, inferior in intelligence to almost any living quadrupeds, and millions of years were to elapse before they slowly evolved a higher intelligence and finally became capable of articulate speech. So it is utterly impossible that a tradition could have been handed down from the time when dinosaurs really existed. Nor is it to be supposed that the dragon myths are based upon discovery of their fossil remains, for in the millions of years that have elapsed since their time, the sand and mud in which their remains were buried have been converted into hard sandstone and shale, and the bones so thoroughly petrified that they appear much like the rock itself. They would not easily be recognized as bones at all, and it would be quite out of the question for primitive man to get any correct notion of the kind of animals they represented if they happened to come across a few fragments unearthed out of the rock. Dinosaur bones may conceivably pass for bones of giants, but the concept of the dragon could not possibly be founded upon them. There remains a third explanation, that in some region of the world dinosaurs might have survived until more recent times and have been seen by primitive men. But from what is known of the geological history of life, this supposition is so exceedingly improbable as to amount to an utter impossibility. One is obliged to conclude that the dragon is wholly a creation of the imagination of man, its source being probably among the races of Eastern Asia. How and why it came to assume its present conventional form would require a broad knowledge of the early history and mythology of these races to discern. In the traditions of the northern races, the dragon legends are engrafted upon the myth of the giant serpent, the worm, which in the Old Norse story encircles the earth, lying at the bottom of the surrounding ocean. This same myth, in another form, is handed down as the sea serpent. Sea serpents, however, are easier to credit than dragons, partly because less is known about the inhabitants of the sea than those of the land, partly because among the multitudinous forms of ocean life there are many that correspond more or less with the preconceived idea of what a sea serpent ought to be like. So that while the dragon is confined to legend and no one professes to have really seen one, there be many, down to the passengers on modern ocean liners, who have testified to seeing a sea serpent of approved type. Sometimes it may be one of the large sea snakes, sometimes a ribbonfish or a school of porpoises following one another as they leap out of the water so as to give the impression of the rolling coils of a great serpent. Sometimes a long streamer or a tangle of seaweed may look like the giant serpent with its maned neck, which all expect to see. Possibly among the unknown inhabitants of the great deep, some such animal may really exist. But until it is captured and its remains deposited in some museum of natural history, it must be ranked upon fabulous monsters. The unicorn of classical writers was a real animal, the great one-horned rhinoceros of India, well known to Eastern writers and not unfamiliar to the patrons of the Greek or Roman circuses. In medieval Europe, it suffered a curious transformation. the northern artist had never seen a rhinoceros, nor talked with anyone who had. He knew that it was a great four-legged beast with a long horn on its forehead and the traditional foe of the lion. So he grafted the twisted tusk of a narwhal on the forehead of a horse, and in this form it was conventionalized in heraldry, its source not recognized when, centuries later, the rhinoceros was reintroduced to the knowledge of Western nations. The various composite monsters of the mythology of different races, the centaurs and sirens of the Greeks, the mermaids and swan maidens of Western Europe, the winged bulls of Assyria or the eagle-headed gods of Egypt, have all a more or less definite religious significance and are theological rather than zoological myths. Some of them have survived in zoological lore, supported, like the sea serpent, by the occasional sight of animals more or less resembling what the observer expected to see, and their described appearance colored by the traditional description. Mermaids appear every now and then in the accounts of medieval writers. Some of the stories may well have been based on the manatee or dugong, while in more recent years actual specimens of stuffed mermaids, manufactured by the ingenious Japanese from the forepart of a monkey and the tail of a fish, have often been exhibited. To another class of zoological myths belong the innumerable fanciful stories told of the characters and habits of real animals, of the transmutation of men into animals and vice versa, and of the transformation of one species of animal into another. Real metamorphosis of form, as of the tadpole into the frog, or of the larva into the perfect insect, is well known to modern natural history, but however much or little a primitive ancestry may have known about it, there seems to be no good reason to believe that the enchantment transformations of mythology originated in any real observations of metamorphosis in nature. Dream experiences imperfectly separated from the recollections of waking hours had probably much to do with their conception. Hence, it would seem that while natural history possesses relations which may throw its beginnings to the fabulous monsters of ancient times, the same cannot be said for the science of zoology, which as a science requires evidence, and having classified that evidence is loth to admit therein such mythical creatures who are undoubted aliens. End of section 1.
Section 2 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melanie Young. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. Edited by Francis Rotweiler. Zoology, Development and Distribution. The animal kingdom includes a vast variety of organisms whose common basis of life is the cell. They are, like plants, an organized community of cells. The various members of this community are adapted to perform different services, and many groups have specialized, each for its particular function, so that the individual cells are no longer capable of a separate life. The animal or plant is thus not a mere aggregate of living cells, but an organism. In the successive classes and orders of animals, from lowest to highest, there is a progressive complexity in the organism, a more and more absolute and exact limitation of the cells or groups of cells to special functions. This progressive specialization is the key to the life history of the individual organism, the development or ontogeny of the animal, and to the life history or phylogeny of the race. All animals are to be regarded, then, as organized communities, the units of these communities being protoplasm cells, originally identical in structure and capable of all the necessary activities of life, but specialized to perform particular functions. The first steps in the plan of organization, as they appear in the development of the individual, are identical in all animals. The cell divides and redivides until it forms an aggregate of numerous small cells, the blastula. This aggregate, continuing to subdivide, then takes on a thimble-like form, the gastrula, one layer of cells lining the cavity, the other being external. This cavity is primarily to contain and digest food, and the cells lining it naturally take on the functions of nutrition, while the outer cells, in contact with the outside world, take on the functions of sensation, of offense and defense, and procuring food. The living sponges and hydroids illustrate this stage of development, more or less modified. The next important stage in development is the formation of a third intermediate layer of cells between the inner layer, or endoderm, and the outer layer, or ectoderm. From this intermediate layer are developed in the higher animals the muscles, circulatory system, and various glands and organs. The alimentary system with its glands being developed from the endoderm, the skin, the nervous system, and the organs of sensation from the ectoderm. From this point onward, fundamental differences are to be found in the plan of organization of the principal types of animals, and the organs adapted to serve the same purposes are often developed from different parts and in a different manner. It is upon these fundamental differences in organization that the classification of the animal kingdom is based. These lower animals are derived from the same stock as the higher ones. They persist today because they are perfectly adapted to their habitat and mode of life, or because they have gotten into a groove of evolutionary progress, which did not allow them to advance so fast or so far as the higher types, or because of arrested development from obscure causes. Some of the factors which have limited their evolution are clearly seen. Others are, and perhaps always will be, difficult to trace. Life originated in the ocean, or at all events in water. But the dry land environment has stimulated a higher evolution, the obvious cause being the more abundant supply of oxygen, admitting of more active life. In order to preserve the form and relations of their parts, all animals of any considerable size have been compelled to develop a rigid framework or skeleton of some kind. The material and position of this skeleton and its further use for purposes of offense and defense have profoundly influenced the further development of the race. In the lower animals, the skeleton is generally external, and the insects may be considered as representing the highest possibilities of a development based upon an external skeleton. In the vertebrates, the skeleton at first was mainly external, but this became gradually replaced by an internal structure, and the higher possibilities of development with the internal skeleton form one leading cause for the higher development and greater size attained by vertebrated animals. The third and perhaps the most important factor in causing or arresting evolution is in the nature of the environment, whether constant from age to age or subject to slow secular or periodic change during geological time. If an animal is fitted to its mode of life and the conditions of its immediate surroundings remain unchanged, the organism has no occasion to vary and tends to become fixed and unprogressive. But if the conditions are slowly changing, the race must become adapted to fit its new environment, and will retain or acquire a variability which through the influence of selection will lead to greater progressiveness. The uniform and unchanging conditions of the deep sea have not been favorable to progress. The theater of evolution of marine organisms has been the ever-changing littoral region, the shores of the ocean, advancing and retreating through successive geological periods, widely varied in character, ranging from rocky coast to sandy shoals, or from muddy flats to the still, clear water of protected inlets. Some of the deep-sea organisms, such as protozoans and sponges, have remained unchanged so far as is known from the earliest geological periods down to the present day. Others, like the crinoids or sea lilies, long since extinct in the littoral region, have found in the ocean depths a refuge where they still survive. Others again, like the deep-sea fishes, originally adapted to the life of the shore, have become curiously modified to suit the conditions of the ocean's depths. Easily evident, likewise, is a corresponding difference between freshwater and land animals. There can be no doubt that all terrestrial life was ultimately derived from an aquatic ancestry. Those animals which have solved the problem of the utilization of the more abundant oxygen supply of the air, instead of the limited amount available in the water, having been able to assume a higher development and greater progressiveness, and the snails among mollusks, the insects among arthropods, and the reptiles, birds, and mammals among vertebrates are the highest types in their respective classes. The freshwater animals, more limited in possibilities of development and subject to less change and variation in their conditions of life, are of inferior type, and as in the deep sea, among them may be noted survivals of very ancient and primitive organisms, and higher types developed upon the land, but readapted to aquatic life. Having once acquired the capacity to use the oxygen of the air, however, they are careful not to lose it again, and remain air breathers, however far their adaptation to aquatic or marine life may be carried in other respects. It will have been noted that reference has been made to the ancient forms of life, thousands of varieties of which passed out of existence long before the existence of man, and it is natural to ask by what means their nature is learned. To reply by fossils without determining what a fossil is would be to beg the question. The term fossil, which originally meant merely things dug out of the ground, has come to have a much more definite and restricted meaning in the language of modern science. Fossils are the remains of animals or plants, or indications of their former existence, found buried in the soil or enclosed in the rock. In general, only the hard parts of animals are preserved, the shells of mollusks and crustaceans, and the bones of the vertebrate animals, while the fact that they are preserved at all is due to a combination of favorable circumstances. Usually, when an animal dies, the flesh or soft parts decay or are devoured. The hard parts last longer, but gradually disintegrate into formless dust or mud, under the influence of the atmosphere or the air-bearing waters of the surface. But if the animal is buried in a swamp, a river bottom, lake, or estuary, where sediment is being piled up by the action of the rivers or of the sea, its hard parts may be covered up in time to escape destruction to get below the zone of atmospheric influence. In this case, the remains will be subject only to the influence of the mineralized waters that permeate the soil and rocks beneath the surface. The action of these waters is to dissolve, particle by particle, the organic matter of the fossil, and to replace it with mineral matter. In this process, known as petrifaction, usually the structure is preserved as well as the external form. The bone or shell is thus converted wholly into stone, solid and permanent like the sediment in which it was buried, now converted by the same agencies into rock. This is the ordinary process by which fossils are made. There is nothing mysterious about it. It is merely the natural result that water seeping upward toward the surface, loaded with mineral matter and destitute of organic matter, tends to dissolve any organic matter it finds on its way and deposit mineral matter in all the minute cavities left, until they are filled and the porous mud or sand becomes solid impermeable rock. Fossils, then, preserved in this manner, constitute the record of the history of life on the Earth. It is an incomplete record. Long periods of time are unrepresented, because the sediments then deposited have been washed away or deeply buried, or the fossils in them destroyed by crystallization. A large proportion of the past life of this planet is imperfectly recorded, or altogether lost because the animals had no hard parts to be preserved. The vast majority of the records are undiscovered or inaccessible, because they are still buried far beneath the surface. And moreover, the interpretation of the records is often doubtful. Yet the importance of paleontology, or the study of fossil remains, is great, and its teaching positive because the evidence is direct. No one today would venture to question that the fossils of the rocks are the actual remains of animals which lived and died in former ages. And the scientist's knowledge of existing animals and plants is now complete enough for him to be able to declare positively that the animals which formerly inhabited the world were different from those of today, and that in proportion as research is pushed backward in time, the earlier forms were more and more diverse from their modern successors. Furthermore, it is seen that the lowest and simplest groups of animals were of the earliest introduction to the past life of the world, and that the higher groups have successively appeared in order of their complication and specialization in physical and mental structure. Throughout the geological record, there is evidence of annecta, or intermediate types, linking together groups of animals now widely separated, and the earliest appearing members of each group are more or less generalized. That is to say, their bodily structure conforms to the general type of the whole group, but shows a combination of characters which are now found scattered among the various modern members of the group, but seldom or never all combined in one animal. These generalized characters also are apt to be annectant and link the group to other groups. For example, the birds and reptiles are now wide apart, the birds being toothless, feathered, adapted to flight, walking or hopping when on the ground, and with the tail, exclusive of feathers, reduced to a little rudimentary stub, while the reptiles possess teeth and scales and are crawling or swimming, with long vertebrated tails. But all the earliest birds had true teeth like reptiles, and the oldest of them, the Archaeopteryx, a long vertebrated tail feathered on the sides like the head of an arrow. And on the reptilian side are found the dinosaurs, among the more ancient reptiles resembling birds in many details of their bony structure, and especially in their long legs, adapted to walking instead of crawling. And the pterodactyls, a group of flying reptiles, the latest of them tailless and toothless, with horny beaks like the birds. Again, there is a great gap among modern animals between fishes and four-footed animals of the land. But the most ancient fishes are precisely those which come nearest in structure to the higher vertebrates, and from which these might most readily have been derived. Through all the invertebrate groups, the same conditions appear. Thus, in a broad way, the discoveries of paleontology tend continually to break down the sharp lines of distinction between great modern groups and classes of animals, and do so in just such a way as must follow if the doctrine of evolution be true. If the various species, genera, orders, and classes of animals are derived from a common ancestry through the evolutionary process, it should be possible to trace the successive steps in the evolution and differentiation of each race by the fossil remains of its ancestral stages in the successive geological epochs. This has been done precisely and in detail in many instances. That it has not been done in all is due to the imperfection of the geological record, to a peccable knowledge of it, and especially to the vastness of the problem and the limitations in the means, facilities, or insight of those who are laboring to solve it. Broadly and approximately, the course of the evolution of animal life has been traced out from the indirect evidence of structure and individual development, and the more direct but less complete evidence of paleontology. The task of working out and proving it in detail is as yet far from complete. But among the thousands of workers who are devoting their lives to the study of fossils and their meaning, not one has been led to deny the truth of evolution or to doubt the theory of descent. difference of opinion among scientific men is as to the method, not as to the fact. Closely allied to the nature of the animals of the past is the question of their habitat in early times, involving the problem evoked by their present geographical distribution. There are very few species of animals which inhabit more than a portion of the world. Most of them are limited to quite a small part of the land or water areas. Man is perhaps the most cosmopolitan of all land animals. He inhabits every considerable land area of the globe, except the Antarctic continent and a much smaller area around the North Pole. Most animals, however, are limited in their distribution by uncongenial climate or by barriers, which the species has not found means of crossing. With land animals, these barriers may be broad stretches of ocean, extensive deserts, high mountain ranges, or great rivers. With sea animals, they may be continental barriers, uncongenial stretches of coast, and sometimes the volumes of fresh water poured out by great rivers. But the limitations imposed by climate and temperature are the most efficient barriers to the worldwide distribution of either land or sea animals. Animals are dependent directly or indirectly upon plants for their food, and the abundance and rapid growth of vegetation in the tropics affords opportunity for a corresponding development of animal life. The profusion and variety of life in the tropics cannot fail to impress an observer from the temperate zone. The struggle for existence everywhere going on is perhaps somewhat different in character. It is an internecine war, a strife for survival among the animals themselves rather than a combat against an unpropitious climatic environment. In the temperate, and especially in the Arctic regions, the element of struggle against the untoward conditions of outside nature is superadded to the ever-present war against other animals, which, scattered over a wider space, is less apt to impress the observer, although its influence on the development of the race may be no less powerful. Here, perhaps, in the double struggle against animals and against nature itself, lies the reason for the dominance of temperate and northern types when brought into competition with the more abundant but less severely selected races of the tropics. This fact is familiar in the case of man, but it is equally true among animals. The tropic regions, with their abundant food and easy life, are the refuge of inferior races, succumbing and driven forth before the sterner competition of the north. The zoological realms and provinces of the world correspond broadly with the geographic divisions, and even to some extent with the political divisions, since geographic and climatic barriers have conditioned the distribution of the races of men and thus largely influenced their governments. In the land fauna, it is observed that the great land mass of the northern continents forms one great zoological realm, the Holarctic. South America, a second, the Neotropical. Africa, south of the Sahara, a third, the Ethiopian. And Australia, a fourth, the most isolated of all. The various islands partake more or less of the character of the mainland adjoining, but there are marked differences which point to a different distribution of land and water in former times than now. Thus, the animals of the British Islands are almost identical with those of continental Europe, while the animals of Madagascar are widely different from those of Africa. The simplest explanation, obviously, is that the former have been connected with the mainland of Europe, since the present species of animals came into existence. The latter has been separated from the mainland since remote ages. Geological considerations support this view. The marine provinces corresponded in part with the great oceans, but are more influenced by zones of temperature than those of the land. So far as shore animals are concerned, their lines of distribution will be along the coastlines, and a broad area of deep sea is as much a barrier to most of them as is a land barrier. Like the land animals, however, they give convincing evidence of former differences in the distribution of land and water. There is a considerable proportion, for instance, of identical species on the two sides of the Isthmus of Panama, not found on the Asiatic or European coast. Hence, there must have been communication between Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, either at the Isthmus of Panama or elsewhere, since these species came into existence. They could not have gone around the Horn because they are tropical species and are not found on the shores of temperate South America. The geographic distribution of animals, present and past, together with the geological record of the evolution of each race, furnishes a most important line of evidence on the past history and geography of the globe. And under the name paleogeography, a branch of study is being built up which is of great scientific importance as well as of transcendent interest. Its scope and vastness of purview are readily recognized when it is remembered that an intimate knowledge of zoology and of geology, each of them vast and comprehensive, is a prerequisite. Especially is this true of the lower orders of life, which, despite their simplicity, afford the most fascinating realms of investigation. End of Section 2. Recording by Melanie Young.
Section 3 of the Science, History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy Park. The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 6, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler, Zoology. Chapter 3, The Lower Invertebrates. Part 1. From the earliest times when sponges were believed to be but solidification of the foam of the sea, they have been an element of curiosity to men. They have been declared to be animal, to be vegetable, and to be mineral. Ancient naturalists quarreled over the question whether they could move or no, and Aristotle's decision that they were animal because they shrank when moved from their rock bases provoked a storm of dissent. Even so keen an observer as Lamarck believed the apertures on the surface of a sponge to be the mouths of small cells inhabited by polyps, and he expended no little wonder over the question why a polyp never was to be found in his cell. Hasenel, on the other hand, declared that sponges were created by a giant sea worm, and held that the sponge itself was mere nidus and excretion. It is now known, however, that the ordinary sponge of bathtub importance is the horny skeleton of one of the simplest kinds of animals. In life, this horny framework is lined with an inner and outer layer of cells. It is fast to a rock or coral block. Its movements consist only in inducing a current of water through the pores by means of tiny whiplashes attached to inner cells, and by a certain amount of contraction and expansion of the entrances to the pores. The cells absorb and digest any food matter that is brought by the currents of water passing through the pores. Most of the growth is by budding. Bisexual reproduction does occur, however, alternately with the giving off of gemmules or independent buds. These gemmules, produced in the autumn, develop into male and female forms, and the ova from the one, fertilized by spermatozoa from the other, give rise to a summer generation of sponges, which in turn produce gemmules. This alternation of generations is not uncommon among lower animals. There is a great variety of sponges, some with calcareous skeleton, others with horny or siliceous skeletons. They are nearly all marine, and the best known kinds are tropical. The commercial sponges, of which the best come from the Mediterranean and Indian seas, are found in clear water at moderate depths. The fishermen locate them by looking through a glass-bottomed bucket and pull them up with a pair of hooks on the end of a long pole. They are left upon the shore to die and decompose and then washed and bleached. Among the siliceous sponges, some, like the Venus flower basket, are exquisitely beautiful in the form and structure of the skeleton. These live at great depths and are obtained by dredging. Fossil sponges are found in the most ancient rocks. Professor Caillou has discovered the spicules of siliceous sponges in the Archean rocks of Brittany, which would make them the oldest fossils known, and they are common in the oldest fossiliferous formations of other parts of the world. So that the testimony of the rocks appears to confirm what would be expected, that the sponges are the most ancient, as they are the simplest of the metazoa or many-celled organisms. The corals and sea anemones, hydroids and jellyfish, grouped under an order Coelenterata, are but little less simple in form. In all these animals, the structure consists simply of a body cavity with a fringe of tentacles around the edge. The tentacles are stinging and sensitive cells which serve to capture food. The body cavity is lined with digestive cells which serve to digest it, and is sometimes partially divided up by partitions extending inward from the outer wall. And the outer layer of cells may secrete a calcareous shell which serves as protection. The jellyfish are free-swimming organisms, the hydroids and sea anemones are fixed to the bottom, and the corals are great colonies of individuals which secrete a calcareous shell. The translucent milky umbrella-like disc of the jellyfish, lazily opening and closing as it floats along the tide, is familiar to everyone. Beneath the disc hangs a circle of long tentacles, stinging cells which serve to kill or paralyze small fishes or other minute animals that may come in contact with them, and are floated into the body cavity by a current of water produced by the lashing of cilia or whip cells in the same way as in sponges. Many jellyfish can inflict a sting sufficient to cause severe pain to the incautious hand which touches them. The structure of the stinging tentacles is very curious. A.G. Mayer in his Seashore Life describes them as follows. The long flexible tentacles arise from the side of the bell near the rim. The tentacles are covered with wart-like clusters of minute thread cells, each containing a coiled tube which can be turned inside out as we might do with the finger of a glove. If the tentacles come in contact with a small fish or crustacean, these little stinging threads are instantly discharged, and on account of their minute size they penetrate the skin of the prey, carrying with them a poison, believed to be formic acid, which quickly paralyzes the victim. The jellyfish produces eggs, which however do not develop directly into free-swimming jellyfish, but into fixed hydroids, and these in turn bud off jellyfish. This is another example of alternate generations. Hydroids differ from jellyfish in being fixed to the bottom. They are like little vases, the lid lined with stinging tentacles, and many of them develop by budding into compound colonies. Many of the jellyfish are strongly phosphorescent at night, and swarms of them floating in the water make a very brilliant display when stirred up by a boat passing through or by the breaking of waves upon the shore. It may seem strange that such an animal as the jellyfish should leave any traces of its presence in the rocks. Nevertheless, under certain favorable circumstances, they may be buried in the sand and converted into siliceous casts without much loss of shape, and these fossil casts, known as star cobbles, are found in the most ancient rocks of the Cambrian period in Alabama and elsewhere. So it appears that jellyfish were among the inhabitants of the seas at the dawn of recorded geological history. A sea anemone, says Mayer, is a barrel-shaped animal. The bottom of the barrel is fastened to some rock or other firm anchorage, while the upper end bears a slit-like mouth which is encircled by a fringe of tentacles. The mouth leads into a simple tube-like throat which is bound to the inner sides of the barrel by means of radiating partitions. The throat tube is, however, only about 1/2 as long as the height of the barrel, so that the radial partitions in the lower half of the barrel cavity do not meet at the center, but leave an open space which is the stomach of the anemone. Sea anemones are among the most attractive of marine animals, beautiful both in form and color. They vary in size from that of a pin's head to several feet across, and they live at all depths and in a great variety of situations. A coral polyp is only a sea anemone which deposits a plate of lime salt at the base of its barrel-like body and between the radial partitions of the stomach cavity. These lime salts form a stony skeleton or substance which we commonly call coral. It is well to remember that the coral animals are not insects, but are merely sea anemones which form stony skeletons. Although sea anemones and coral polyps resemble beautiful flowers when fully extended, they quickly contract into a mere dome-shaped mass when disturbed. In this way, the coral polyps are protected by withdrawing into their stony cup-shaped bases. The coral polyps are glassy white and translucent, and have each from 18 to 24 long tapering tentacles which end in a white knob and are speckled over with white warts. These are the stinging organs which enable the coral to capture its prey of small marine animals. When fully expanded, the polyps are about 1/8 of an inch wide and 3/8 high, but when disturbed they suddenly contract so as to become practically invisible. The colony starts with a single polyp, but soon others bud out from its base, and the cluster increases by further budding from the bases of the older polyps until it may be several inches in diameter. The fleshy coral is found from the eastern end of Long Island to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It is rarely seen in shallow water, but is common upon rocks at depths greater than 20 feet. When first brought up from the bottom, it appears as an ugly, tough, gelatinous mess covered with dull, yellowish-pink, finger-shaped processes. If placed in water, however, the whole mess soon appears studded with beautiful star-shaped polyps, which expand so as to give the appearance of a stump covered with delicate pink flowers. Each of these polyps has a terminal mouth surrounded by 8 tentacles, the sides of which are bordered with rays giving a feathery appearance. The whole colony of polyps develops through constant budding from the sides and bases of the older parts of the colony. Nothing is more strangely beautiful than these coral reefs where the rich purple sea fans and the chocolate sea whips wave gracefully to the surges in the crystal depths, while brilliant fishes glistening in green, blue, purple, and yellow glide in and out among the shadows of the coral caverns. The precious coral of the Mediterranean is allied to the sea whips. Its polyps are brilliant white and have each 8 feathered tentacles, while the internal axis of the colony is red and stony. The stony corals, especially the reef-building kinds, played an important part in the building up of the continents. They flourish in a warm temperature and clear water. In the West Indies, the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, the northeast coast of Australia, and especially in the islands of the Pacific, coral reefs today are building out the land on a gigantic scale, and their influence has been even more important at times in the past history of the Earth. The lower part of the peninsula of Florida consists of a succession of reefs built out one after another, the latest being the Florida Keys. The outer border of the reef is alive and growing, the fragments broken off by the waves from above, filling up the interstices between the growing corals and slowly extending the bank seaward. The lime extracted by the little coral polyps from the seawater and built up into solid limestone reefs would in the course of time exhaust the entire supply of lime salts in the ocean, were it not continually recruited by the lime dissolved from limestones on land by the rain, or liberated in the decay of other rocks. This lime is brought down by the rivers in the form of a soluble bicarbonate, and in extracting it from the seawater, the corals and other lime-secreting organisms set free a certain amount of carbonic acid gas, which again is not without effect upon the climate. Starfish, sea urchins, sea lilies, and sea cucumbers, forming the order of Echinodermata, says Mayer, are also called radiates because in the form of their bodies and arrangement of their organs, they usually display 5 rays. For example, most starfishes have 5 equally developed arms, 72 degrees apart, recalling the rays of a conventional star. In the echinoderms, the skin usually contains a skeleton composed of calcareous plates of definite shapes, all hinged together in an orderly manner so as to make a veritable armor which gives rigidity to the body and protects the soft organs of the interior. In the living starfish, one will see hundreds of little tubular feet which arise from the grooves on the lower side of the arms. When the starfish is turned over upon its back, these feet stretch out to a remarkable length and wave about, seeking to fasten upon something in order to right the animal. It is then we may see that each of these feet is a hollow tube, ending in a cup-shaped sucker. Similar tube feet will be seen in 5 double lines along the sides of the sea urchins. The mouth of the starfish is at the center of the lower surface. On the upper side, and a little away from the center between 2 arms, one will see a spongy-looking area. This is called the madreporic plate, and is the sieve-like entrance to the water tubes of the starfish, which extend down the arms and give rise to little bladder-like vessels, one above each tube foot. The contractions of these little bladders cause the tube feet to elongate by pressing water out into their cavities. The upper surfaces of most of the starfishes are covered with spines, but these are much better developed in the sea urchins, where in addition to spines are found calcareous pincers mounted upon rods, which are used to remove any injurious foreign substance that may fall upon the body of the urchins. The sea cucumbers, or Holothuria, are worm-like in appearance, but are nevertheless closely related to starfishes and sea urchins. They have no spines, and their skeleton is often reduced to minute anchor-shaped spicules within the skin. The mouth is at one end of the worm-shaped body and is surrounded by feathered or branching tentacles. In some species, there are 5 double rows of tube feet down the sides of the body, but in others, these are absent. When disturbed, sea cucumbers have the curious habit of casting out their viscera and afterward regenerating them. They are sluggish creatures and either live within the sand or under rocks or crawl slowly over the bottom, feeding upon minute organisms that are contained in the sand or mud, which they swallow. Sea urchins, or echini, may be compared to starfishes without arms. They are usually provided with a skeleton made for the most part of 6-sided plates fused or rigidly joined together. They have 5 sharp-edged teeth with which they gnaw off minute seaweeds from the rocks. Some species can even gnaw away the rock itself, and in many parts of the world, the sea urchins have literally honeycombed the rocks. Indeed, a sea urchin is often found living in a cavity whose opening is too small to allow of the animal's escape. The common sea urchin of Europe is sold in the markets during the season when it is full of eggs. The sea lilies, or Cremuvia, may be compared to a starfish mounted upon a long stem which arises from the middle of its back and anchors it to the bottom of the sea. The mouth is turned upward and is surrounded by branching arms which sweep gracefully to and fro in search of prey. The echinoderms live only in salt water, but they are found at all depths and in all oceans, from the tropics to the poles. The vast majority crawl over the bottom, but at least one holothurian swims through the water and was at first mistaken for a jellyfish. Most of them cast their eggs out into the water, and the larvae develop bands of swimming cilia, which enable them to swim about for a considerable time. Suddenly, the body of the echinoderm begins to develop with the larva. Most of the old larval body is absorbed or cast off. Starfishes feed upon almost any kind of mollusk, but will also devour barnacles, worms, and occasionally sea urchins, or even the young of their own species. It is estimated that in 1 year, starfishes destroyed $631,500 worth of oysters on the beds of Connecticut alone. In the mode of feeding, the starfish folds its arms over the clam or oyster, and hundreds of the sucker-like tube feet fasten themselves to the valves of the shell, so that finally the mollusk yields to the constant pull of the starfish and the shell gapes open. Then the starfish turns its stomach inside out and engulfs the mollusk. It has been found by experiment that a large starfish can exert a steady pull of over 2 1/2 pounds, and that this is sufficient in time to open the valves of the clam or mussel. The eggs of the starfish are discharged into the water in greatest abundance during the last 3 weeks of June, although they are also to be found throughout the summer and occasionally even in winter. These eggs are soon developed into little transparent larvae covered with tortuous lines of waving cilia and provided with long flexible tubercles. They swim slowly about near the surface and feed upon minute organisms until they grow to be about 1/8 of an inch long. Then the upper and lower halves of the star begin to develop upon each side of the stomach, and in a few hours all of the anterior part of the larva and the tubercles are absorbed, and only a minute star about as large as a pin's head is seen upon the bottom of the ocean. Myriads of these little stars settle upon seaweeds and eelgrass and begin at once to devour the young clams, which also begin life in the same places. Professor Mead found that one of these little stars devoured over 50 young clams in 6 days. The starfishes grow rapidly, and in 1 year they may have arms 2.5 inches long and be ready to spawn. Besides the common 5-pointed starfish, there are many other more or less familiar. The serpent stars have long, slender, flexible arms and are much more active. In the biscuit stars, the arms are branched and forked into a multitude of slender interlaced tips, upon which the animal moves about with the body lifted above the ground. The prickly sea urchins abound along rocky coasts. Along the sandy shores, they are replaced by the sand dollar, flattened out into a thin plate covered with minute brown spines. Sea cucumbers are familiar to everyone who has explored the tide pools of rocky coasts at low water, but other kinds are common on sandy, muddy, or gravelly beaches, living just below low water mark. In China, a species of sea cucumber is prepared and eaten as a delicacy. Sea lilies or crinoids are now rare and confined to deep water, but in the early periods of geologic time, they were very abundant and varied, shore forms as well as deep water species. The oldest of them, dating back to the Cambrian period, suggests a sea urchin which has lost its spines and is mounted upon a jointed stalk. In the crinoids proper, the body has developed branching arms which wave in a feathery plume above it. The fossil crinoids, or stone lilies, are sometimes preserved in wonderful perfection in the Paleozoic limestones and are one of the most attractive of fossils. Great numbers of them have been obtained in the limestones of Crawfordsville, Indiana, and elsewhere in the United States. End of Section 3. Recording by Lucy Park. Section 4 of The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy Park. The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 6, edited by Francis Rothweiler. Zoology, Chapter 3, The Lower Invertebrates, Part 2. The title worms, says Professor Thomson, is hardly justifiable except as a convenient name for a shape. The animals, to which the name is applied, form a heterogeneous mob, including about a dozen classes whose relationships are imperfectly known. But the zoological interest of the diverse types of worms is great. For amid the diversity we discern affinities with Coelenterata, echinoderms, anthropods, mollusks, and vertebrates. Moreover, it is likely that certain worms were the first to abandon the more primitive radial symmetry, to begin moving with one part of the body always in front, to acquire head and sides. And if one end of the body constantly experienced the first impressions of external objects, it seems plausible that sensitive and nervous cells would be most developed in that much stimulated, overeducated head region. But a brain arises from the insinking of ectodermic skin cells, and its beginning in the cerebral ganglion of the simplest worms is thus in part explained. Most of the creatures which fall into this group are of little interest to the general reader. Many of them are parasitic, Some, like tapeworms, threadworms, flukes, and trichinae, are unpleasantly familiar in this connection. The simpler unsegmented worms are those which most nearly represent the remote ancestors of mollusks and of vertebrates. The higher segmented worms, or annelids, follow more definitely along the line of crustacean and insect evolution. In them may be found an arrangement of organs and plan of bodily construction which serves to explain how the organization of the crustaceans and insects has been developed. The common earthworm is most familiar of the annelids, and its anatomy is much more interesting and complicated than might at first be supposed. The surprise is great that awaits the man who first dissects an earthworm. With proper cleaning and dissection, he will be able to see a complex and wonderful structure, a plan of organization wholly different from that of the higher animals, vertebrates, yet subserving to a large extent the same purposes and beautifully adapted to the needs of the earthworm's life and habitation. To tear up that delicate mechanism on the prongs of a fish hook is likely afterward to appear to him a sort of disregard of proportions, much like throwing a gold watch at a stray cat. Of the anatomy a detailed account cannot be given here. It must suffice to say that it has a straight alimentary canal stretching from the mouth at the front end to near the hinder end of the body, the front end of the canal being provided with a muscular ring and with glands which aid it in swallowing and digesting the earth which forms its food. There is a circulatory system consisting of a slender tube along the midline of the back and others along the underside, joined by several cross veins encircling the throat, which by expanding and contracting enable the colorless blood to circulate through the body. It possesses also a nervous system consisting of a cord corresponding to the spinal cord of higher animals, but situated on the underside of the body along the middle line, and double instead of single, with little knot-like expansions or ganglia at every segment, which correspond to the brain of the higher animals, and with a separate pair of ganglia on the dorsal, upper, side of the head, united with the front pair of ganglia of the underside by a pair of cords encircling the gullet. There are no eyes or other specialized sense organs, or special organs of respiration, yet the worm is aware of the approach of enemies or of light and darkness through a general sensitiveness of the skin, and the blood is aerated through the skin. There are, however, the beginnings of organs of excretion to remove waste matter from the circulation, and the reproductive system is quite elaborate, the animal being hermaphrodite, that is, combining both sexes in one individual, but so arranged that the eggs of one earthworm must be fertilized by another. The chief economic importance of earthworms is as principal agents in forming the mantle of humus, or soil, which covers the dry land in all parts of the world, and buries the hard rocks and sterile soil beneath it. Earthworms abound in all parts of the world. They eat their way through the soil and come out at night to the surface, where they forage around for leaves and stray bits of vegetable matter, which they drag to their burrows to be nibbled and swallowed at leisure. Their castings, composed of the earth and comminuted vegetable matter, which they have swallowed and digested, are deposited on the surface, and in the course of their lives they bring up a good deal of the sterile undersoil, mix it thoroughly with particles of vegetation from the surface, and deposit it in their castings. These, accumulating year after year and century after century, form the layer of humus, or topsoil, in which vegetation chiefly thrives and on which the gardener and farmer depend for the successful growth of their crops. Not all the humus is due to earthworms. Insect larvae play some part, and to a large extent it is merely due to natural decay of surface vegetation and its mixture with soil by rain and the dust brought by the winds. But the investigations of Darwin show that the earthworm plays an important part in its formation. Thus, as the tiny coral polyp is ever helping to form the continents on which man can live, and perhaps also to control the climate and moderate the extremes of temperature, so also the earthworm is rendering efficient aid in covering the land with rich and fertile soil, enabling vegetation to flourish and making the earth habitable for the human species. The name mollusks, or soft-bodied animals, covers an immense number and variety of invertebrates. The clams, oysters, and other shellfish, the snails and slugs, the octopus and squid, and many less familiar types. All of them have soft bodies, usually with an external calcareous shell, but with no internal skeleton except in the squids and their relatives. They are much more highly organized than the coral or starfish groups. The arrangement of the organs shows a bilateral symmetry, unlike the radial symmetry of coral or starfish. That is to say, the organs and parts of the body are arranged in pairs on each side of the middle line so that there is a front and a hinder end of the body. On the other hand, the body is not divided into successive segments as in the worms, crustaceans, and insects. Most of the mollusks are sluggish animals, many of them attached to stones or other objects on the bottom, but the squid and cuttlefish are swift and active. The lower surface of the body, says Newton, consists of a thick muscular foot used in creeping. In front of the foot is the head, which may have a pair of eyes and tentacles, while the mouth lies on its lower surface and is often provided with numerous horny, rasping teeth. A flap-like fold of the body extends outward from the sides. This fold is called the mantle, and its free edge and upper part secretes the shell, which usually covers the back of the mollusk. The feathery gills arise from the sides and lie in the space between the lower side of the mantle and the side of the body. The intestine is coiled and opens typically at the posterior end of the body, behind the foot. There is a paired digestive gland, or liver, which pours its secretion into the midgut. The three-chambered heart lies above the hindgut and pumps blood from the gills to other parts of the body. In addition, it may be noted that the mollusks show well-defined muscles and nervous system. The latter consists of a number of ganglia, knots or nodes of gray matter, corresponding in function more or less to the brain of higher animals, connected by cords of nerve fibers, which may be said to correspond roughly to the spinal cord in higher animals. From these ganglia, nerves are given off to the various parts of the body. This concentration of the nervous system into a few defined ganglia connected by cords is a great advance upon the condition in the lower invertebrates, where the nerve cells are diffused and scattered over the surface of the body. It makes possible a much more exact and definite correlation of the movements and actions of different parts of the body. It is like the establishment of a central executive bureau to control and order the activities of some great and complex organization. The great majority of mollusks are marine, chiefly shore-living, although some are adapted to deep-sea life. But many inhabit freshwater lakes, rivers, and streams, and one group, the land snails, has become adapted for terrestrial life, breathing air instead of water. The principal groups of mollusks are 1. The bivalves, or lamellibranchs, comprising clams, oysters, mussels, and other shellfish, in which the shell consists of two valves, right and left. 2. Snail shells, or gastropods, including snails, whelks, periwinkles, limpets, and others, in which there is a single valve, mostly spirally coiled. The symmetry of the animal is obscured in this group by development of one side. In the slugs, the shell has degenerated to a small horny scale buried in the body. 3. Squids and cuttlefish, or cephalopods, including also the octopus, nautilus, and a host of extinct forms. They are free-swimming, active animals with a ring of muscular tentacles around the mouth and part of the foot modified into a funnel, the siphon, through which water can be forcibly expelled from the mantle cavity, driving the animal backward. These are considered the highest development of molluscan life on account of their active habits and more concentrated nervous system. The lamellibranchs feed upon minute organisms, both animal and vegetable, which they sift out from the sea water by the aid of gills. The gastropods are more generally carnivorous, feeding upon other mollusks, which they attack by boring a hole in the shell by means of a ribbon-like tongue, the radula, armed with many small, sharp, horny, rasping teeth, and then sucking out the juices of their victims. This unique little implement appears to be very efficient for its purpose, and is said to be aided by a secretion of sulfuric acid. Other gastropods, such as the periwinkles and the freshwater and land snails, feed upon plants, but all of them possess the radula. The cephalopods also are carnivores, the octopus lying in wait for unwary fish or crustaceans which may come within reach of the long tentacles, the squids capturing their prey by darting rapidly backward, swimming quickly to one side and seizing the victim in their sucker-bearing arms. The mollusca include an immense number and diversity of animals. In the gastropoda alone, there are over 15,000 living species. The Lamellibranchs are hardly less numerous. Many of them are edible, a few are important articles of food. The oyster fisheries in the United States alone are estimated to yield $16,600,000 annually. The soft-shell clam of the North Atlantic, the scallop and the round clam or quahog of the Middle Atlantic states are important articles of commerce, while mussels, whelks, periwinkles, and land snails also are largely eaten in Europe. The pearl oysters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the freshwater pearl clams of the United States are likewise of importance, not only for the pearls but for the much larger industry in mother of pearl obtained from the shells and manufactured into buttons and pearl ornaments. The pearl fisheries in the Persian Gulf alone are said to be worth $2 million annually. The noxious activities of mollusks are slight. A few species commit depredations upon oyster beds. The damage done by the pterodos to timber underwater is more serious. The gruesome tales of attacks upon men by the devilfish or octopus are mostly fanciful. An octopus, if large enough, no doubt could and would attack a man if he came within reach. And once in a while he might catch him at a sufficient disadvantage to overcome and destroy him. But chances for such an encounter with such a result are exceedingly small. Members of this group of mollusks do not attain a gigantic size, however. These huge forms are deep-water organisms and are very rarely seen by men, although they form an important part of the food of marine animals such as the seals and sperm whales. During the whole recorded geologic time, mollusca have been an important element in the marine fauna. Freshwater mollusks are probably equally ancient, and land mollusks are known to have appeared as far back as the Coal Era. Their hard, indestructible shells are the most abundant of fossils, often making up the entire mass of limestone strata. Lamellibranchs, gastropods, and cephalopods were all distinct as early as the Cambrian period. Their evolution from a common stock must date far back into the unrecorded beginnings of geologic time. The shelled cephalopods related to the modern Nautilus attained great size and abundance early in geologic time and were then the dominant type of marine life. In Orthoceras, the shell is sometimes 7 feet long, straight instead of coiled as in the Nautilus. During the age of reptiles, the cephalopods were again very abundant marine forms. The ammonites, baculites, etc., coiled, partly coiled, or uncoiled, being probably more nearly related to the squid and octopus than to the Nautilus. But the majority of fossil shells are related to the modern limp shells and their allies, the Brachiopoda, which, although mollusk-like, are not true mollusks, the plan of organization of the animal being wholly different. The shell may be distinguished by the fact that its valves are dorsal and ventral instead of right and left, with respect to the symmetry of the animal. These Brachiopoda are considered a class apart or grouped with bryozoans into the Molluscoidea. Their relations are about as close with worms as with mollusks, but not very near to either. The living brachiopods are rare deep-water organisms, crowded out from shallow water by competition of the more highly organized mollusks, but in early geologic times they were the common shells of the seashore. With the crustaceans begins the anthropod series of invertebrates, characterized by a segmented body, jointed limbs, and an outside skeleton. The name Anthropoda, jointed feet, points to the distinction that separates them from the worms. But their plan of organization is evidently derived from that of the segmented worms or annelids. The crustaceans are adapted to aquatic life and breathe by gills. The insects are adapted to terrestrial life and breathe by trachea. The spiders and their allies include both land and aquatic types, differing from either insect or crustacean in their plan of organization. The lobster and crayfish are the most typical crustaceans, the first marine, the second living in fresh water. In comparison with the worms, it is observable that while the body is segmented, the segments are not all alike, but are divided into two regions, the head and thorax and the abdomen. Likewise, the appendages are not mere bristles as in the worms, but jointed and specialized to serve different purposes. The most anterior ones, antennae and antennules, are organs of touch and smell, enabling the lobster to feel his way about. Next come 6 pairs which serve chiefly to aid in biting and chewing the food. Then the large forceps to seize the prey, then 4 pair which are used in walking, and 6 posterior pairs used mainly for swimming purposes. Altogether, there are 19 pairs of appendages. The stalked eyes are not classed as appendages, being of different origin. The segments and appendages are enveloped in a tough, horny covering, flexible at the joints, hardened elsewhere by lime salts into rigid armor. The internal organs of the lobster are much more elaborate than in the worm, but their general plan is much the same. The nervous system is more concentrated, the muscles are distinct and well developed. The alimentary system consists of first a gizzard with a complex mill for grinding up the food, then a midgut stomach with a large digestive gland which takes the place of liver, pancreas, and in part the stomach glands of higher animals. And finally a long straight hindgut which takes but small part in the digestive process. The colorless blood enters the heart from the gills through valves which admit of entrance but not of exit. Thence it is pumped through well-defined arteries to the tissues of the body, from which it returns through ill-defined channels to the gills. The gills are feathery structures of a rather complex nature, presenting a large surface to the current of water which the animal keeps going through them by paddling with part of the 5th pair of appendages. There is also a distinct excretory system, kidney, and the reproductive organs are more elaborated than in the worm, the sexes being separate. It is thus a much higher type of animal than the earthworm, but the plan of organization is the same as it is also in the insect. The mollusk and the vertebrae are organized upon entirely different plans. The lobster occasionally attains great size, and one specimen, 3 feet and 6 inches long and 30 pounds in weight, was captured off the New Jersey coast in March 1897. The snapping prawns are little lobster-like crustaceans of the American coast. The largest are not more than 1 3/4 inches long. One claw is much larger than the other and is provided with a sharp-edged blade, which is normally held out at right angles to the claw. At the least alarm, this blade is closed with a sharp snap, reminding one of the explosion of a small torpedo. These little creatures live in crevices or coral reefs, under shells and stones, and fairly swarm in sponges, so that when a sponge is lifted from the water, its crackles as if filled with minute firecrackers. The shrimps are similar in many ways, but are free swimmers. A crab is essentially a lobster with its tail turned in under its body. It is the highest of the crustacea, and the species is widely distributed and varied, extending from the combative edible or blue crab to the parasitic hermit crab, ranging in size from the tiny oyster crabs which live with the gill cavity of the oyster, to the giant spider crab of Japan which attains a span of 12 feet, including deep sea crabs which never come to the surface, and the land crabs of the tropics which rarely enter the water, and which, like the robber crabs, climb trees and live on coconuts. Barnacles, while mollusk-like in appearance, are really crustaceans, which have affixed themselves to rocks or floating objects and are enclosed in a hinged calcareous shell. As Huxley put it, they are fast to a rock by their heads and kick the food into their mouths. The stalked barnacle, or goose barnacle, was believed by writers of the Middle Ages to undergo a metamorphosis into a species of goose, the barnacle goose, and this transformation was repeatedly asserted in the most positive terms down to the time of Linnaeus or even later. Being encased in a natural armor, says Mayer in Seashore Life, Crustaceans cannot grow at a uniform rate but enlarge suddenly at the periods when the shell is shed. This occurs at fairly regular intervals, and the entire shell is shed, even the coverings of the eyes and part of the lining of the stomach being cast off. The creature is then soft and helpless, and usually remains hidden in some safe retreat until the body has expanded and the new shell hardened. Owing to their hard outer armor and their aquatic life, remains of crustaceans are very common as fossils, and there is a fairly complete record of their evolution. The higher types, such as crabs and lobsters, did not appear until after the coal period. But the more primitive, mostly minute crustaceans, known as ostracods and phyllowpods, have been traced as far back as the Cambrian, nearly to the beginning of recorded geological history. The trilobites, familiar to every geologist, were a primitive group of crustaceans which flourished during the older geologic periods, becoming extinct in the coal period. They are very abundant and characteristic fossils in Paleozoic strata. Many of them attained considerable size, the largest up to 2 feet in length. End of Section 4. Recording by Lucy Park.
Section 5 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6, edited by Francis Rolfe Wheeler. Zoology, Chapter 4, The Higher Invertebrates, Part 1. It seems natural to think of a spider or scorpion as an insect, but in fact, they are not true insects, although they belong to the arthropod series of invertebrates. All insects have 3 pairs of legs and breathe by tracheae. Spiders and scorpions have 4 pairs of legs and breathe by lungbooks, an apparatus like modified gills. And in all the details of their anatomy, spiders and scorpions are as different from insects as they are from crustaceans. All insects, excepting perhaps a few unimportant primitive kinds, have wings or have had them at a former period in the development of the race, although in many groups the wings are degenerate or lost. Scorpions and spiders appear never to have developed wings at all. In short, the insect class may be regarded as an adaptation of the arthropod invertebrates to aerial life, the spider class to terrestrial life, the crustaceans to marine life. Each in its own element has had a long and more or less successful career. Each has made attempts to invade the territory of the others. For in the West Indies and other oceanic islands are crabs which pass their life mostly on dry land, and the spider swinging in air from a slender thread, and even in some cases traveling through the air on a long film of unattached gossamer, is emulating the habits of the flying insect. But the insects alone have invaded the alien habitats with any great success, and so far as terrestrial life is concerned, they have crowded the spiders and scorpions to the wall. Scorpions are found only in tropical countries and are distinguished by the elongate tail with venomous tip and the large clawed, grasping legs in front. They have 4 pairs of walking legs like spiders. In the old natural history books, they are credited with committing suicide when unable to escape by stinging themselves to death. Unfortunately for the story, aside from the argument that the mental processes of the lower animals are not very likely to lead them to deliberate suicide, the feat is anatomically impossible, and if it were possible, the poison would have no effect. Spiders are common everywhere, and like scorpions, they are all carnivorous, sucking the juices of insects which they capture. Many of them, but not all, form webs, and the construction of the web is a remarkable piece of engineering, which must involve highly elaborated instincts comparable only to those of the higher insects. The material of the web is a liquid silk secreted by the spinning glands and forced through the fine tubes of the spinnerets, hardening immediately on exposure to the air. The spun threads are used also to line the nest, to envelop the cocoon, and to assist the spider in his aerial gymnastics. The spiders are by no means confined to webs, but certain of them construct more permanent dwellings. Thus, the mason spiders dig a hole in the ground and then spin across and across the mouth of it a woven door with a hinge at one side. Even less known and more curious is the work of a little water spider who, not desiring to forego the power of air breathing, spins a silken diving bell wherein is imprisoned a globule of air. Male spiders are very much smaller than the females, the difference in bulk being sometimes as 1,300 to 1, and more brightly colored. With spiders and scorpions are classed various parasitic insects, such as mites and ticks, and other minute and degenerate forms. The king crab, or horseshoe crab, has also been discovered to be more nearly related to the arachnoids than to the crustaceans, which it resembles in appearance and habitat. And another group of aquatic animals, the eurypterids, now extinct, is regarded as most nearly related to the scorpions among living animals. The eurypterids inhabited brackish or fresh water during the Paleozoic era, and some of them attained a length of 6 or 7 feet, a truly formidable size for that ancient period. The numbers and variety of insect life are far beyond those of any other animals, at least upon the land. More than half the described species of zoology are insects. More than 3/4 of the land animals belong to this class, and the innumerable hosts of some sorts make them, despite their small size, the most dreaded and dangerous enemies with which man has to contend. The seriously noxious insects are indeed a small minority. Most are indifferent so far as man's welfare is concerned. A few are actively beneficial. But as a class, it must be affirmed that the harmful activities of insects outweigh their beneficial action. They are rivals with man for the possession of the fruits of the earth, and if to the damage on this score be added their activities as carriers of infectious diseases, they may well be regarded as the most formidable enemies of man in the animal kingdom. The insect is an evolution from the primitive worm or annelid type, adapted to terrestrial life as the crustacean is to marine life, and the structure and plan of organization is much the same in both. There are two most important differences. The first of these is that the crustacean breathes by gills, the insect by tracheae, branching tubes which ramify into every part of the body and by expanding and contracting, take in fresh and expel vitiated air as do our lungs. The second difference is that the insect has wings, generally 4 of them. The arrangement of the nervous system, the circulation, the appendages and mouth parts, the sense organs, and the alimentary system are much as in crustaceans. In comparison with higher vertebrates of the land, the insect shows a fundamentally different plan of organization. Thus, in a vertebrate, the principal nervous system is along the dorsal, in an insect, along the ventral side of the animal. In a vertebrate, the jaws open up and down, and the teeth are originally modified scales. In an insect, the jaws open sideways, and the teeth are modified legs. In a vertebrate, the skeleton is internal. In an insect, it is external. The heart of a vertebrate is in its thorax, the stomach in its abdomen. In an insect, the position is reversed. The vertebrate pumps vitiated blood from the tissues to the lungs to be aerated. The insect pumps fresh air to freshen the vitiated tissues directly. The wings of a bird or a bat are modified legs. The wings of an insect are outgrowths from the skin of the back, and so on throughout. The resemblances between insects and land vertebrates are mostly superficial. Their plan of organization is wholly different, and the similarity is due to both being adapted to live on land. The resemblances between insects and crustaceans indicate relationship. Their plan of organization is fundamentally the same, the differences being due to adaptation to terrestrial life in one, to aquatic life in the other. Note that there are water insects and likewise land crustaceans, but the land crustaceans still breathe by gills, a method evidently adapted for water breathing, and the water insects are dependent upon air for breathing, so that they have to come to the surface from time to time at least. The most important feature of the development of the higher orders of insects is the metamorphosis or change of form from larval to adult. The egg hatches into a larva wholly different from the adult in form, internal organs, and manner of life, and the larva, in changing to the adult form, undergoes a metamorphosis which involves the almost complete breaking down of all the structures of the body into a mass of formless tissue, and the rebuilding out of this formless tissue, the organs and parts proper to the adult. This extraordinary change takes place in from 2 or 3 days to several weeks, and the insect undergoing it is called a pupa. In the lower orders of insects, there is no metamorphosis or a very incomplete one. The meaning of this change and the object of it in furthering the interests of the insect is not very clear. Obviously, the wingless crawling larva may be regarded as having once represented the ancestral type from which the insect is descended, but as now greatly altered to fit the requirements of its own juvenile habits and environment. And it is possible to explain the breaking down of the old tissues into a formless mass of cells by supposing that larva and adult have each proceeded so far on their divergent specializations of structure and form in adaptation to the needs of each, that it has become cheaper, so to speak, to break down the old tissues and build anew, rather than to modify the old into the new tissues along the lines of natural development. Setting aside certain primitive wingless insects, the three orders, Ephemerida, Plecoptera, and Odonata, mayflies, stoneflies, and dragonflies, are given lowest rank among insects because of their incomplete metamorphosis. All of them haunt the freshwater ponds, rivers, or streams wherein their larvae dwell, and are not seen far away from water. The larvae are at first wingless, provided with gills instead of spiracles, so that they are not obliged to come to the surface. They develop rudimentary wings during their larval life and change to the adult form by a succession of molts like crustaceans, without any breaking up of the internal structures. The dragonflies are unexcelled among insects, says Kellogg, for swiftness, straightness, and quick angular changes in direction of flight. The successful maintenance of their predatory life depends upon this finely developed flight function, together with certain structural and functional body conditions which might be said to be accessory or auxiliary to it. All have 4 well-developed wings. The body is long, smooth, and subcylindrical or gently tapering. This clean, slender body offers little resistance to the air in flight and serves as an effective steering oar. The wings are long and comparatively narrow, fore and hind wings being much alike. The head is unusually large and more than 2/3 composed of the pair of great compound eyes. More than 30,000 facets have been counted in the cornea of certain dragonfly species. For accurate flight and successful pursuit of flying prey, the dragonfly has full need of good eyes. The jaws are strong and toothed, and obviously well adapted for tearing and crushing the captured prey. When the prey is come up with, however, it is caught not by the mouth, but by the leg basket, and then held in the forelegs while being bitten and devoured. The internal anatomy is specially characterized, as might well be imagined, by a finely developed system of thoracic muscles for the rapid and powerful motion of the wings and the delicate and accurate movements of the legs. The respiratory system is also unusually well developed. The prey of the dragonfly may be almost any flying insect smaller than itself, although midges, mosquitoes, and larger flies constitute the majority of the victims. The good that is done by dragonflies through their insatiable appetite for mosquitoes is very great. Now that we recognize in mosquitoes not only irritating tormentors and destroyers of our peace of mind, but alarmingly dangerous disseminators of serious diseases, malaria, yellow fever, filariasis, any enemy of them must be called a friend of ours. Dragonflies are a very ancient race of insects. They tenanted the strange antique forests of the coal period, and some were, for an insect of gigantic size, one having a spread of wing of nearly 2 feet. Others are found in the still older forests of the Devonian, and indeed it is to the ancient life and ancient land that dragonflies seem peculiarly appropriate. The dark, somber, tropical swamp forests of those early days, their trees gigantic club mosses, ferns, and horsetail rushes, before the appearance of flowers, of broad-leaved trees, of land vertebrates, seem peculiarly fit to be tenanted by insects which today are associated with similar life conditions, and which have no relations with flowering plants or with the higher developments of insect life. The various kinds of bugs, scale insects, and plant lice which make up the order of the Hemiptera, or bugs, have the mouthparts modified into a sucking beak. They feed upon the juices of living plants or the blood of living animals, and include the worst of insect scourges. Owing to their sucking habits, they are more difficult to combat than the biting insects, and their fecundity is enormous. The order Hemiptera, says Kellogg, includes over 5,000 known species of North American insects, representing a large variety and a great economic importance. Some of the most destructive crop pests and most discomforting insect scourges of man and the domestic animals belong to this order. The chinch bug's ravages in the corn and wheat fields of the Mississippi Valley offer effective evidence to the dismayed farmers of the workings of a displeased providence. The tiny sap-sucking aphids and phylloxera and insignificant-looking scale insects make the orchardist and vine grower similar believers in supernatural moral correction by means of insect scourges. And the piercing and sucking lice and bugs, in the English meaning, make personal and domestic cleanliness a virtue that brings its own immediate reward. The name Hemiptera is derived from the character of the forewings shown by most, though by no means all, of the members of the order. This is the thickening of the basal half of the otherwise thin membranous wing, so that each forewing is made up of two about equal parts of obviously different texture and appearance, hence half-winged. All Hemiptera, except the male scale insects, have an incomplete metamorphosis, the young at birth resembling the parents in most essential characteristics except size and the presence of wings. By steady growth, with repeated moltings and the gradual development of external wing pads, the adult form is reached, without any of the marked changes apparent in the insects of complete metamorphosis. With similar mouth parts, the young have, in most cases, similar feeding habits, preying upon the same kinds of plants or animals that give nourishment to the parents. The extent of the injuries done by various members of this order to farm and orchard crops, to meadows and forests, and to our domestic animals is enormous. Of the other insects, the order of beetles includes numerous crop pests, and the caterpillars of many moths and a few butterflies do much damage. Locusts have a healthy appetite for green things, and many kinds of flies could be lost to the world to our advantage. But perhaps no other order of insects has so large a proportion of its members in the category of insect pests. The single Hemipterous species, Blissus leucopterus, better known by its vernacular name of chinch bug, causes an annual loss to grain of $20 million. The grape phylloxera destroyed the vines on 3 million acres of France's choicest vineyards. The San Jose scale has in the last 10 years spread from California to every other state and territory in the United States and become a menace to the whole fruit-growing industry. So, despite their small size and their general unfamiliarity to laymen, the Hemiptera are found by economic entomologists in their warfare against the insect scourges of the country to be one of the most formidable of all the insect orders. Remedies for sucking insects are not readily found. Kerosene emulsion is the one chiefly employed. Fumigation or spraying with tobacco is effective on a small scale. And for scale insects, when the leaves are off the trees, hydrocyanic acid fumigation or lime sulfur salt spraying are used. The orange scale has been successfully held in check by importing and fostering a ladybird beetle which feeds upon it, and the chinch bug by introducing a parasitic fungus which kills the bugs by wholesale when the weather conditions favor its spread. The order Orthoptera includes the cockroaches, locusts, grasshoppers, and crickets, all familiar types of insects, many of them of large size, and several ranking among the important noxious insects. On the other hand, their active leaping and noisy flight, their cheerful trilling and chirping lend a variety and interest to outdoor life which one might sadly miss if deprived of their companionship. Their music is rather instrumental than vocal, since it is made by rasping the wings against each other or against the roughened inner surface of the thighs. In all this order, the mouth parts are modified for biting, and they mostly live on vegetable food, especially upon green leaves. In the grasshoppers, locusts, and crickets, the hind limbs are modified for leaping. The cockroaches, preying insects, and walking sticks are walking or running types. The roaches are one of the most ancient and persistent groups of insects. They shared with the dragonflies the dominance of the ancient forests of the coal period, and are today a familiar household pest, especially in tropical countries and aboard ships. The mantis or praying insect is a carnivorous type, feeding upon flies or other insects which may come within reach, and its curious attitudes have caused a variety of fanciful or superstitious legends to gather around it. To kill a mantis is very generally considered sinful or unlucky, and among the quaint monkish legends is one of St. Francis Xavier, who, seeing a mantis moving along in its solemn way, holding up its two forelegs as in the act of devotion, desired it to sing the praise of God, whereupon the insect caroled forth a fine canticle. The most singular of the orthopterous insects are the walking sticks, which mimic the green twigs and stalks of grass among which they live, in form, color, and characteristic attitudes, so closely that they are one of the best examples of protective mimicry. The swarms of locusts, which from time to time descend upon cultivated agricultural regions, devouring every green thing in their path and bringing ruin and desolation to the farmer, are now known to be normally inhabitants of the high-lying grassy plains, driven from their accustomed feeding grounds by exceptionally dry seasons, which have withered and destroyed the grass of the high plains. They cannot maintain themselves permanently in the moist climate of the low-lying valleys, and for their periodical incursions, there is little remedy except to fight them in the high dry plains which are their natural home. The termites, or white ants, are quite unrelated to the true ants and quite unlike them in appearance. They belong to the lower orders of insects. The young are like the adult from the time they emerge from the egg and do not undergo any metamorphosis. But, like the ants, they have an elaborate social organization and live in great colonies, mainly composed of sterile workers of several castes. Among the ants, bees, and wasps, these sterile workers are always females. With the termites, they are of both sexes. The colony is presided over by a royal pair whose functions are confined to egg laying. As with the ants, the workers are wingless, and the fertile males and females are winged only during the swarming season, when they leave the nest to found new colonies. Termites live upon dead wood and are abundant mainly in tropical or subtropical regions, where they are fearfully destructive to all wooden buildings, furniture, etc., except they be constructed from some of the few kinds of wood that are immune to their attacks. The great hillock nests which they construct are a prominent feature of the landscape in some parts of tropical Africa. Their habits and complex social organization are almost as remarkable as those of the ants, but the communal instinct is not quite so strongly developed. End of section 5. Section 6 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Zoology, Chapter 4, The Higher Invertebrates, Part 2. With the beetles, or Coleoptera, begins the series of higher insects with complete metamorphosis. That is to say, the young develop from the egg into a larva, quite unlike the adult in form, structure, and habits, wingless and more or less worm-like in appearance and habits. After a period of active growth, the larva becomes quiescent, wrapping itself up usually in a cocoon or protective case, and undergoes a remarkable change, the organs and tissues of the body being largely broken down and reformed. And finally, the completed insect, or imago, issues from the cocoon or cell, perfect in form and widely different from the larva, not merely in its external form, but in the whole internal structure as well. This extraordinary change, which has often been used as an apt natural illustration of ethical regeneration, is one of the most striking and wonderful features of insect life. It is completely carried out in the beetles, moths, and butterflies, the lace-winged flies, the two-winged flies, and in the ants, bees, and wasps. The lower orders of insects exhibit various degrees of approximation toward it, but in none of them is it complete. The beetles include a vast multitude of different species and genera. 12,000 species are known from the United States and Canada alone. All of them are distinguished by the hard, horny forewings, which serve as a sheath for the membranous hind wings, these alone being used for flight. The body is compact in form, covered by hard, horny skin, and the mouth parts are adapted for biting, the jaws often strong and large. Some beetles are predaceous. Others, and these the great majority, are plant eaters, and some of them are notorious pests. Among the noxious beetles may be especially noted the potato bug, wireworms, white grubs, and other beetle larvae, fruit and grain weevils, apple tree borers, and a host of less important ones. The predaceous beetles, on the other hand, are actively beneficial by destroying quantities of noxious insects. Among the handsomest members of the order are the tiger beetles and the various predaceous ground beetles, active, alert, many of them of bright metallic color patterns. Many beetles, like the fireflies and glowworms, are luminous at night. Some of the tropical fireflies emit light enough to read by when a few of them are placed under a glass. The stag beetles and rhinoceros beetles are among the largest of a group, Lamellicornia, notable for the huge mandibles and various peculiar horn-like processes developed in the males of many of the species. The numerous kinds of wood-boring species, some of them of giant size, do serious damage to orchards and forests. The little round ladybird beetles, or ladybugs, with their polka dot pattern of red and black, on the other hand, are a great help to the gardener and fruit raiser, as they feed upon plant lice and scale insects. In the large group, which includes the curculios, weevils, and snout beetles, the front of the head is prolonged into a long beak, at the tip of which are the small, sharp jaws. Many of these also are serious insect pests. The diptera, or two-winged flies, includes gnats, mosquitoes, and the innumerable kinds of true flies, an immense group, including some 50,000 species, many of them familiar from the annoyance they inflict on men and animals, and in recent years more seriously considered as carriers of disease. The mouth parts in all are adapted for sucking and piercing, and they have but two wings, the hinder pair being converted to little structures which are used to balance or direct the fly in his flight. The mosquitoes are familiar from the tropics to the poles, but it is only in recent years that their relations to 3 serious diseases of man have been suspected and proved. It has been shown beyond question that the germs of malaria, yellow fever, and filariasis are transmitted from man to man through the agency of mosquitoes. The life history of the malaria germ has been quite thoroughly investigated. Malarial fever, which is the most deadly disease of the tropics, is caused by a minute amoeba-like one-celled organism, parasitic in the blood corpuscles. These grow and multiply asexually in the human blood, but their sexual multiplication occurs within the stomach cavity of the mosquito Anopheles. Thence they make their way to the poison gland of the insect and are so introduced into the body of the next person bitten by this species. The Anopheles is the mosquito with spotted wings, fortunately less common than the gray-winged or brindle-winged mosquitoes of the genus Culex. Another mosquito, Stegomyia, is responsible for the dissemination of yellow fever and of filariasis, the life history of the germ proceeding along much the same lines as with the malaria germ, so far as it has been investigated. The destruction of mosquitoes, especially of the Anopheles and Stegomyia, and protection from their attacks have consequently been recognized as a most important safeguard to health, especially in tropical countries. Protection is chiefly to be had by extensive and thorough screening of houses and porches, Destruction of the mosquito larvae can be effectively accomplished by draining swamps and stagnant pools in which they chiefly breed, and where draining is impossible, by periodically covering the surface of the water with a thin film of kerosene. Standing water in cisterns or rain barrels should be carefully screened. By these methods of prevention, the mortality from malarial fever and yellow fever in tropical regions has been greatly reduced when, as in the construction of the Panama Canal, they have been systematically and thoroughly applied. The smaller gnats and midges are nearly related to the mosquitoes and are equally a pest throughout the world from their bloodthirsty habits. The compact, heavy-bodied flies with short antennae are a much larger group than the mosquitoes, and many of them attain large size. The great majority are harmless to man, a few beneficial as they prey upon noxious insects, but some do serious injury to growing crops, the larvae or maggots feeding upon the leaves or roots of the plants. A few, such as the bot flies, are parasitic upon animals or man, and others, like the house flies, blowflies, and their allies, are annoying and disgusting pests and dangerous spreaders of disease. The agency of the housefly in disseminating typhoid fever in cities and camps has been properly appreciated only in recent years. Dr. L. O. Howard has recently suggested that in view of its activities in this direction, it might most appropriately be called the typhoid fly. This fly breeds in stable manure and other decaying matter, and thorough cleanliness and sanitation has already accomplished wonderful results in reducing the death rate from diseases which are largely spread through its agency. Related to the flies, although given a separate ordinal rank, are the fleas, degenerate blood-sucking parasites of mammals and birds, which likewise take part in the dissemination of certain diseases. They are wingless, with peculiarly compressed bodies and mouth parts adapted for piercing and sucking. The moths and butterflies, order Lepidoptera, are the insects, says Kellogg, most favored of collectors and nature lovers. A German amateur would call them the Lieblingsinsekten. The beautiful color patterns, the graceful flight, and dainty flower-haunting habits, and the interesting metamorphosis in their life history make them very attractive, while the comparative ease with which the various species may be determined and the large number of popular as well as more technical accounts of their life, which are accessible for information, render the moths and butterflies most available among all the insects for systematic collecting and study by amateurs. This great group of insects ranks with the beetles and flies in abundance and variety. Between 6,000 and 7,000 species are found in North America alone, but they are even more numerous and varied in tropical regions. They attain their greatest size and beauty of color and pattern in the equatorial forest regions, especially in South America. The exquisite color patterns are due to the covering of minute scales over wings and body. The scales, which are to be regarded as modified hairs, vary in shape and size from 1/350th to 1/30th inch, and their brilliant metallic colors are mainly due to diffraction of light from their finely striated surfaces, while the black, brown, yellow, and dull red colors are due to pigment color in the scale itself. In this group are to be found the most striking examples of protective coloration, of warning colors, of mimicry, and other more obscure phases of adaptive coloration. The Lepidoptera all undergo a complete metamorphosis, and their caterpillars are more familiar objects than the larvae of any other group of insects, as they live mostly on green leaves and are active and voracious feeders. Owing to their habits and numbers, many of the larvae rank among the plagues of farmer, gardener, or tree grower. The adults, mostly nectar-sipping, are harmless as they are often beautiful. The silk moth, from whose cocoons the world's supply of silk is obtained, is also of high economic importance. The annual production of raw silk is estimated at over $100 million. Yet this is but small, probably, compared with the total amount of damage done to gardens, orchards, and fields by the depredations of the various caterpillars of one kind or another. Among butterflies, the palm is generally given to the giant morphos and their relatives, whose brilliant metallic colors brighten the gloomy recesses of the Brazilian forests. These, like many other inhabitants of the deep forest, habitually fly far above the ground among the treetops and are consequently more difficult to secure. In temperate climates, the swallow-tailed butterflies, Papilio, and its relatives are the most widely admired. One of the most familiar of the larger butterflies is the monarch, which owes its success in life partly to its secreting an acrid, ill-tasting fluid that causes birds to let it severely alone. This butterfly is closely mimicked by another, the viceroy, which is not ill-tasting, but doubtless profits by this resemblance in escaping the attacks of birds. The order Hymenoptera, in which are included ants, bees, and wasps, is the most interesting group among all the lower animals, because many of its members have a highly complicated and elaborated communal life. The study of these great insect societies, of their social life, habits, and instincts, is one of the most interesting subjects in the whole range of natural history. From the days of Solomon, the tireless industry and frugality of the ant have been proverbial. The busy ways, the complicated and orderly activities of the bee are familiar to everyone, and Maeterlinck's brilliant and sympathetic description of the life of the great bee communities in his The Life of the Bee, although perhaps too much tinged with the natural tendency to interpret it in terms of human reason and sensations to be wholly reliable, is one of the most fascinating chapters of natural history ever written. Besides these better-known social insects, the Hymenoptera include a variety of solitary forms, sawflies, gallflies, and ichneumons, and among the bees and wasps there are all degrees of social organization, from solitary to highly elaborated social types. It is especially through the study of these various grades of organization that an understanding can be obtained of the true meaning of many features of the social life of ants and bees, and of how they were developed. In order to appreciate the character and limitations of their social life, it is necessary first to get some insight into the nature of this intelligence. The nervous system in insects and crustaceans consists of a double cord on the ventral side of the body with paired nodes or ganglia at each segment from which the nerves are distributed, and a pair of principal ganglia on the dorsal side of the head connected with the ventral system by a ring of nerve fibers encircling the gullet. In the higher insects, the dorsal ganglia of the head are expanded into a small mass which corresponds in the main with the brain of the higher animals. But the ventral ganglia also perform part of the functions which in the vertebrates are concentrated in the brain, and the relative size and complexity of the brain mass in insects is by no means to be compared with any of the higher vertebrates. The deficiency is especially in the parts corresponding to the cerebrum, lodging the higher intelligent and reasoning powers, the automatic and instinctive acts being governed mainly by the enlarged ventral ganglia. So far as can be judged, the nervous system of an insect is that of a very elaborate and perfect animal automaton, but not much more. It is natural to suppose, on seeing the complex and varied activities of an ant or bee community, that these insects must possess an intelligence comparable with that of man rather than of the lower animals, and ideas of their life are apt to be colored by this view. But the most eminent modern authorities on their psychology, among whom Professor Forel may be especially mentioned, believe that, while not devoid of intelligence, their actions are, in the main, instinctive and automatic, and that even their intelligent action degenerates into habit, that is, tends to become automatic much more rapidly than in higher animals. The extreme complexity of these instincts can be better understood if it is remembered that the insects are a very ancient group. Little of their early history has been definitely ascertained, but the lower orders of insects, at least such as cockroaches and dragonflies, appeared far back in the age of invertebrates, almost as early as the beginning of the geologic record, and the higher orders are known to have existed at a time when highest vertebrates had not advanced beyond the modern salamanders and newts. During the millions of years since that time, while the vertebrates were slowly developing an intelligent brain, the higher insects were elaborating an instinct brain. The most serious difficulty in understanding the actions of insects is that their senses are so different from those of man. Broadly speaking, indeed, they make use of the same media of communication with the outer world. All of them have organs sensitive to ether rays of light and heat, corresponding to human eyesight and to the sense of heat and cold. Most of them have apparatus to sense the waves of sound, although less developed than the ears of vertebrates and different in mechanism. All of them have organs for perception of solid bodies and of the minute particles given out from them, corresponding to the senses of touch, taste, and smell, but differently situated and combined, and generally much more elaborated. The antennae of insects are sensitive to touch and odor, and in most of the higher insects are highly specialized organs. In the ants especially, they usurp the place which in most animals is taken by the eyes. Picture to yourself says Forel, an olfactory sense, that is to say, a chemical sense effective at a distance and, like our sense of smell, capable of receiving impressions from particles of the most diverse substances diffused through the atmosphere, located not on your nostrils, but on your hands. For of such a nature is the position of the olfactory sense on the antennal club of the ant. Now imagine your olfactory hands in continual vibration, touching all objects to the right and to the left as you walk along, thereby rapidly locating the position of all odoriferous objects as you approach or recede from them, and perceiving the surfaces both simultaneously and successively as parts of objects differing in odor and position. It is clear from the very outset that such sense organs would enable you to construct a veritable odor chart of the path you had traversed, and one of double significance. 1. A clear contact odor chart, restricted, to be sure, to the immediate environment, and giving the accurate odor form of the objects touched, round odors, rectangular odors, elongate odors, etc., and further, hard and soft odors in combination with the tactile sensations. 2. A less definite chart, which, however, has orienting value for a certain distance and produces emanations which we may picture to ourselves like the red gas of bromine, which we can actually see. If we have demonstrated that ants perceive chemical qualities through their antennae, both from contact and from a distance, then the antennae must give them knowledge of space, if the above formulated law is true, and concerning this there is little doubt. This must be true even from the fact that the two antennae simultaneously perceive different and differently odoriferous portions of space. They must therefore also transmit perceptions and topographically associated memories concerning a path thus touched and smelled. Both the trail of the ants themselves and the surrounding objects must leave in their brains an odor image of immediate space, and this must render associated memories possible. Thus, an ant must perceive the forms of its trail by means of smell. This is impossible, at least for the majority of the species, by means of the eyes. It will appear, therefore, that this antennal sense, which Forel designates as topographical, is the principal means by which the brain of the ant is placed in communication with the outside world, supplying the space and form perceptions in the same way that a vertebrate's eyes do. Light and darkness are indifferent to an ant, so far as getting about is concerned. Many of the species use their eyes, but do not depend primarily on them. Others are blind, or nearly so. This topochemical sense is present in other insects to a varying extent. In bees and wasps it is well developed, although not to the exclusion of sight as in ants. In flies and dragonflies, and in most of the lower insects, it is more or less rudimentary. They depend chiefly upon the eyes. There are other wide differences in the external sense organs of the various insects from man and from each other. Insects see colors differently. They hear sounds to which the human ear is not sensitive, while they are deaf to tones that it perceives. Their world of perceptions is so different in its nature and its limitations that it is difficult to enter very far into the psychology even of their simplest sensations. For the most part, the facts can only be related as they appear. The ever-present temptation to interpret the actions of an insect in the terms of the observer's sensations is almost sure to lead him astray. In most of the lower animals, the young are well able to take care of themselves. In general, they develop from the egg with little or no help from their parents. But in the Hymenoptera, as in birds and mammals, the young are helpless larvae, unable to forage for themselves and requiring to be supplied with food or fed directly by the adults. This is the most important fact in the life history of these insects. It differentiates them as of distinctly higher type than any other invertebrates, and it is around the care of the young that their social life chiefly centers. It has been well observed that in man, the duration and helplessness of infancy is in direct proportion to the progress of civilization. It is equally true of the lower animals, that those in which the young require and obtain the help of their parents in their early life are thereby enabled to reach a higher stage in development than those in which the young can and do shift for themselves from the time they emerge from the egg. All of the Hymenoptera make provision in one way or another for their young, and the extent to which this care is carried is the index of development in the different groups. The sawflies, the lowest member of the group, merely place the eggs in favorable spots on the stems of plants where the larvae can feed readily upon the juices of the plant. These larvae are little more helpless than true caterpillars and feed in much the same way. The gall flies show the next stage in progress. The eggs are laid in the leaves or stems of various plants in such a position that the irritation of their presence stimulates the plant to develop abnormal growths or galls, which are utilized as food by the larvae. The ichneumon flies lay their eggs in the bodies of caterpillars, and the larva develops at the expense of its unfortunate host. A great variety of the lower Hymenoptera are parasitic in this way upon other insects of various orders, and the parasitism has entailed more or less degeneracy. The life histories of these various parasitic forms form a very curious and interesting chapter in natural history. End of section 6.
Section 7 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Young. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. Edited by Francis Rottweiler. Zoology, Chapter 5. Insect Social Communities, Part 1. The study of the habits of solitary wasp and bees and the transitional forms between these and the social kinds give the clue to the method of development of these great insect societies and helps to explain many features of their life otherwise incomprehensible. In the first place, it is evident that their activities center largely around the care for the young. The larva develops from the egg as a helpless, footless maggot, unable to forage for itself, unable to protect itself from enemies. It is dependent, among bees and wasps, upon the food supplies stored up in the cell with the egg. Among ants, it is fed directly by the workers by regurgitation from their crops. Solitary wasps form a group to be considered by themselves. Thus, the digger wasp, or sphex, does not live in communities, but the females make separate nests, one for each egg, provisioning them with insect prey which they sometimes kill, but more generally merely paralyze beforehand by stinging them. J.H. Faber describes their habits in his Insect Lab as follows. The nests may be of mud and attached for shelter under leaves, rocks, or eaves of buildings, or may be burrows hollowed out in the ground, in trees, or in the stems of plants. The adult wasp lives upon fruit or nectar, but the young grub or larva must have animal food. And here the parent wasp shows a rigid conservatism, each species providing the sort of food that has been approved by its family for generations. One taking flies, another bugs, and another beetles, caterpillars, grasshoppers, crickets, locusts, spiders, cockroaches, aphids, or other creatures, as the case may be. The solitary wasp mates soon after leaving the nest in the spring or summer. The males are irresponsible creatures, aiding little, if at all, in the care of the family. When the egg-laying time arrives, the female secures her prey, which she either kills or paralyzes, places it in the nest, lays the egg upon it, and then in most cases closes the hole and takes no further interest in it, going on to make new nests from day to day. In some genera, the female maintains a longer connection with her offspring, not bringing all the provisions at once, but returning to feed the larva as it grows, and only leaving the nest permanently when the grub has spun its cocoon and become a pupa. The egg develops in from 1 to 3 days into a footless maggot-like creature which feeds upon the store provided for it, increasing rapidly in size and entering the pupal stage in from 3 days to 2 weeks. In the cocoon, it passes through its final metamorphosis, emerging as a perfect insect perhaps in 2 or 3 weeks, or in many cases, after the winter months have passed and summer has come again. Probably no solitary wasp lives through the winter, those that have come out in the spring or summer perishing in the autumn. The habit common to almost all of the solitary wasps, says Kellogg, of so stinging the prey, caterpillars, spiders, beetles, flies, bugs, or whatever other insects are used to provision the nest, as not to kill but only to paralyze it, is perhaps the most amazing part of all the interesting behavior of all these wasps. The advantage is obvious. Killed, the prey would quickly decompose, and the hatching carnivorous wasp larva would have only a mass of, to it, inedible, decaying flesh, instead of the fresh live animal substance it demands. But if stored unhurt, the prey would, if a cricket or spider or similarly active animal, quickly escape from the burrow, or if a caterpillar or weak bug, at least succeed, albeit unwittingly, in crushing the tender wasp egg by wriggling about in the underground prison cell. More than that, unhurt, some insects could not live without food the many days that are necessary for the development of the wasp larva, especially in the face of the frantic and exhausting efforts they would be impelled to in their attempts to escape. But paralyzed, there is no exertion. Metabolism is slight, and life without food is capable of being prolonged many days. The paralysis is due to the stinging by the wasp of one or more of the ganglia, or nerve centers, of the ventral nerve cord. The amazing expertness and accuracy displayed in plunging the sting into exactly those spots where injury will give rise to exactly that physiological phenomenon in the prey that will make it available for the special conditions attending the wasp larva's sustenance. This adroitness and the seeming knowledge of the structure and the physiology of the prey have led some entomologists to credit the solitary wasp with anthropomorphic qualities that are quite unwarranted. The whole behavior is probably explicable as a complex and advantageous reflex or instinct developed by selection. Similarly, the whole course of the nest building and provisioning is an elaborate performance wholly for the sake of the young, which the mother will likely never see. And these young in turn will, if females, do the same thing, perfectly, and in essentially, if not exactly, the same manner, without ever previously seeing such remarkable processes performed. All these complex and altruistic habits have naturally led to much speculation concerning their origin and their relation to psychical conditions. Whether a consciousness of what is being done and an intelligence is brought to bear upon its doing, whether we may contribute to the wasp a psychical state with its attributes of cognizance, reason, and emotion, these are questions which are debated warmly. The consensus of opinion, however, is distinctly adverse to reading into the behavior of Ammophila or any of its allies anthropomorphic attributes of reason, consciousness, or emotion. The fixity and inevitableness which is preeminently characteristic of the behavior of the wasp, and the fact that each female is ab ovo, adequate to carry through the complex train of actions without teaching, experience, or opportunity for imitation, practically prove all this seeming marvel of reasoned care for the future young to be an inherited instinct incapable of essential modification except by the slow process of selection through successive generations. The social wasp, hornets, yellowjackets, and such, live in great communities of males, females, and a third caste, the neuters or workers. These last are in reality sterile females, taking no part in the reproduction of the race, but take charge of the building and caring for the nest of the community, bringing food and rearing the young. The life history of a community in general outline is given by Kellogg as follows. In the early spring, fertilized females, or queens, which have hibernated as adults in sheltered places, as crevices in stone walls, under logs, stones, etc., come out from their winter hiding places, and each makes a small nest containing a few brood cells. In each cell, an egg is laid, and food consisting of insects, killed and somewhat masticated, is hunted for and brought to the larvae throughout their brief life by the queen. The larvae soon pupate in the cells and in a few days issue as winged wasps. They are exclusively workers. These workers now enlarge the nest, adding more brood cells in which the queen deposits eggs. The bringing of food and the care of the young now devolve on the workers. The new or second brood also is composed of workers only, and these immediately reinforce the first brood in the work of enlarging the nest and building new brood cells. Thus, through the summer, several broods of workers are reared until the late summer or early fall a brood containing males and females as well as workers appears. The community is now at its maximum, both as regards population and size of nest. In the species Vespa, which make the great ball-like aerial nests, the community may grow to number several thousand individuals. The males and females mate, presumably with members of other communities. But no more eggs are laid, and with the gradual coming on of winter, the males and workers and many of the females die. There persist only as survivors of each community a few fertilized females. These crawl into safe places to pass the winter. Any social wasp found in wintertime is thus almost certainly a queen. Those of the queens which come safely through the long winter found the communities which lived through the following season. The social wasp of the genus Vespa, the familiar yellowjackets and hornets, are the ones which build the large subspherical nests familiar to all outdoor observers and related to much boyish adventure. Inside the great globe are several horizontal combs of brood cells and tiers, all enclosed by several layers of wasp paper. The large bald-faced hornet, Vespa maculata, is the best-known builder of the globe nests. The smaller yellowjackets, Vespa germanica, Vespa cuneata, build in hollows in stumps or stone fences or underground. Such protected or underground nests are not as thoroughly or thickly enveloped in paper, as are the exposed arboreal globe nests. The miniature queen nest of the Vespa, with the single little brood comb inside, may often be found by careful searching in the spring. The long-bodied, blackish wasp of the genus Polystase builds single exposed horizontal combs out of wasp paper or chewed wood, which are attached to the underside of porch roofs, eaves, ceilings of outbuildings, etc., by a short central stem. The little comb made by the queen may contain but half a dozen cells, but after the workers hatch, many other cells are added around the margin. But the nest and workers never compare in size and numbers with the large communities of Vespa. Among all the wasps, the adult feeds upon nectar of flowers, but the larva is fed on insects, paralyzed or freshly killed. The solitary kinds store up food and place it in the cell with the egg. The social wasps do not, but the queen at first and afterward the workers forage for insects, which they bring in constantly and feed to the larva in a killed and partially masticated condition. Bees differ from wasps in that the young larva, as well as the adult, is fed upon the nectar and pollen of flowers, converted into honey and bee bread instead of upon insect food as in the wasp. The structure of the mouth parts and the instincts of the bee differ accordingly. There are a great many kinds of solitary bees, but the social bees, the wild bumblebee and the hive bee, are by far the most familiar. In the solitary bees, there are only males and females. In the social bees, as in social wasps, there are males, females, and workers. The bumblebee's nest underground, occupying and enlarging a mouse hole or small burrow. And the life history of the community is much like that of the wasp. They do not make honey cells, but mix pollen and honey to a pasty mass, deposit a few eggs upon the mass, and in the later stages of the nest build waxen cells for the larva to pupate in. The honeybees, Melipona and Apis, have a much more elaborated community life. And unlike the wasp and bumblebees, this does not terminate with the summer, but is continuous from season to season. The Meliponas are tropical bees, stingless or nearly so, living in immense communities, whose life history is not completely known. The better-known hive bees, Apis, are native to the Old World, but domesticated and introduced everywhere. The habits and life history of the great hive bee communities have been more carefully studied than any other phase of insect life. Yet there are many unsolved problems, especially in regard to the interpretation and meaning of their behavior. A well-written and reliable account of the life of the hive bees is given in Jordan and Kellogg's Evolution and Animal Life, from which the following may be quoted. An interesting series of gradations from a strictly solitary through a gregarious to an elaborately specialized communal life is shown by the bees. Although the bumblebee and the honeybee are so much more familiar to us than other bee kinds, that the communal life exemplified by them may have come to seem the usual kind of bee life, yet, as a matter of fact, there are many more solitary bees than social ones. The general character of the domestic economy of the solitary bees is well shown by the interesting little green carpenter bee, Ceratina duca. Each female of this species bores out the pith from 5 or 6 inches of an elder branch or raspberry cane, and divides this space into a few cells by means of transverse partitions. In each cell she lays an egg, and puts with it enough food, flower pollen, to last the grub or larva through its life. She then waits in an upper cell of the nest until the young bees issue from their cells, when she leads them off, and each begins active life on its own account. The mining bees, Andrena, which make little burrows in a clay bank, live in large colonies. That is, they make their nest burrows close together in the same clay bank. But each female makes her own burrow, lays her own eggs in it, furnishes it with food, a kind of paste of nectar and pollen, and takes no further care of her young. Nor has she at any time any special interest in her neighbors. But with the smaller mining bees, belonging to the genus Halictus, several females unite in making a common burrow, after which each female makes side passages of her own, extending from the main or public entrance burrow. As a well-known entomologist has said, Andrena builds villages composed of individual homes, while Calictus makes cities composed of apartment houses. The bumblebee, however, establishes a real community with a truly communal life, although a very simple one. The few bumblebees which we see in wintertime are queens. All others die in the autumn. In the spring, a queen selects some deserted nest of a field mouse or a hole in the ground, gathers pollen which she molds into a rather large, irregular mass and puts into the hole, and lays a few eggs on the pollen mass. The young grubs, or larvae, which soon hatch, feed on the pollen, grow, pupate, and issue as workers, winged bees a little smaller than the queen. These workers bring more pollen, enlarge the nest, and make irregular cells in the pollen mass, in each of which the queen lays an egg. She gathers no more pollen, does no more work except that of egg laying. From these new eggs are produced more workers, and so on until the community may come to be large. Later in the summer, males and females are produced and mate. With the approach of winter, all the workers and males die, leaving only the fertilized females, the queens, to live through the winter and found new communities in the spring. The social wasp, as with the bees, there are many more kinds of solitary wasp than social ones, show a communal life like that of the bumblebees. The only yellow jackets and hornets that live through the winter are fertilized females, or queens. When spring comes, each queen builds a small nest suspended from a tree branch or in a hole in the ground, which consists of a small comb enclosed in a covering or envelope open at the lower end. The nest is composed of wasp paper made by chewing bits of weather-beaten wood taken from all fences or outbuildings. In each of the cells, the queen lays an egg. She deposits in the cell a small mass of food consisting of some chewed insects or spiders. From these eggs hatch grubs which eat the food prepared for them, grow, pupate, and issue as worker wasps, winged and slightly smaller than the queen. The workers enlarge the nest, adding more combs and making many cells, in each of which the queen lays an egg. The workers provision the cell with chewed insects, and other broods of workers are rapidly hatched. The community grows in numbers and the nest grows in size until it comes to be the great ball-like oval mass which we know so well as a hornet's nest, a thing to be left untouched. When disturbed, the wasps swarm out of the nest and fiercely attack any invading foe in sight. After a number of broods of workers has been produced, broods of males and females appear and mating takes place. In the late fall, the males and all of the many workers die, leaving only the new queens to live through the winter. End of Section 7. Recording by Melanie Young. Section 8 of The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6, edited by Francis Holt Wheeler. Zoology, Chapter 5, Insect Social Communities, Part 2. Honeybees live together, as we know, in large communities. We are accustomed to think of honeybees as the inhabitants of beehives, but there were bees before there were hives. The bee tree is familiar to many of us. The bees, in nature, make their home in the hollow of some dead or decaying tree trunk and carry on there all the industries which characterize the busy communities in the hives. A honeybee community comprises 3 kinds of individuals, namely a fertile female or queen, numerous males or drones, and many infertile females or workers. These 3 kinds of individuals differ in external appearance sufficiently to be readily recognizable. The workers are smaller than the queens and drones, and the last two differ in the shape of the abdomen, or hind body. The abdomen of the queen being longer and more slender than that of the male or drone. In a single community, there is one queen, a few hundred drones, and 10 to 30,000 workers. The number of drones and workers varies at different times of the year, being smallest in winter. Each kind of individual has certain work or business to do for the whole community. The queen lays all the eggs from which newbies are born, that is, she is the mother of the entire community. The drones or males have simply to act as royal consorts. Upon them depends the fertilization of the eggs. The workers undertake all the food getting, the care of the young bees, the comb building, the honey making, all the industries with which we are more or less familiar that are carried on in the hive. And all the work done by the workers is strictly work for the whole community. In no case does the worker bee work for itself alone. It works for itself only insofar as it is a member of the community. How varied and elaborately perfected these industries are may be perceived from a brief account of the life history of a bee community. The interior of the hollow in the bee tree or of the hive is filled with comb, that is, with wax molded into hexagonal cells and supports for these cells. The molding of these thousands of symmetrical cells is accomplished by the workers by means of their specially modified trowel-like mandibles or jaws. The wax itself of which the cells are made comes from the bodies of the workers in the form of small liquid drops which exude from the skin on the underside of the abdomen or hinder body rings. These droplets run together, harden and become flattened, and are removed from the wax plates, as the peculiarly modified parts of the skin which reduce the wax are called, by means of the hind legs, which are furnished with scissor-like contrivances for cutting off the wax. In certain of the cells are stored the pollen and honey, which serve as food for the community. The pollen is gathered by the workers from certain favorite flowers, and is carried by them from the flowers to the hive in the pollen baskets, the slightly concave outer surface of one of the segments of the broadened and flattened hind legs. This concave surface is lined on each margin with a row of incurved stiff hairs, which hold the pollen mass securely in place. The honey is the nectar of flowers which has been sucked up by the workers by means of their elaborate lapping and sucking mouthparts, and swallowed into a sort of honey sac or stomach, then brought to the hives and regurgitated into the cells. This nectar is at first too watery to be good honey, so the bees have to evaporate some of this water. Many of the workers gather above the cells containing the nectar and buzz, that is, vibrate their wings violently. This creates currents of air which pass over the exposed nectar and increase the evaporation of the water. The violent buzzing raises the temperature of the bees' bodies, and this warmth given off to the air also helps make evaporation more rapid. In addition to bringing in food, the workers also bring in, when necessary, propolis, or the resinous gum of certain trees, which they use in repairing the hive, as closing up cracks and crevices in it. In many of the cells there will be found not pollen or honey, but the eggs or the young bees in larval or pupal condition. The queen moves about through the hive, laying eggs. She deposits only one egg in a cell. In 3 days the egg hatches and the young bee appears as a helpless, soft, white, footless grub or larva. It is cared for by certain of the workers that may be called nurses. These nurses do not differ structurally from the other workers, but they have the special duty of caring for the helpless young bees. They do not go out for pollen or honey, but stay in the hive. They are usually the new bees, i.e. the youngest or most recently added workers. After they act as nurses for a week or so, they take their places with the food-gathering workers, and other new bees act as nurses. The nurses feed the young or larval bees at first with a highly nutritious food called bee jelly, which the nurses make in their stomach and regurgitate for the larvae. After the larvae are 2 or 3 days old, they are fed with pollen and honey. Finally, a small mass of food is put into the cell, and the cell is capped or covered with wax. Each larva, after eating all its food, in 2 or 3 days more changes into a pupa, which lies quiescent without eating for 13 days, when it changes into a full-grown bee. The new bee breaks open the cap of the cell with its jaws and comes out into the hive, ready to take up its share of the work for the community. In a few cases, however, the life history is different. The nurses will tear down several cells around some single one and enlarge this inner one into a great irregular vase-shaped cell. When the egg hatches, the grub or larva is fed bee jelly as long as it remains a larva, never being given ordinary pollen and honey at all. This larva finally pupates, and there issues from the pupa not a worker or drone bee, but a new queen bee. The egg from which the queen is produced is the same as the other eggs, but the worker nurses, by feeding the larva only the highly nutritious bee jelly, make it certain that the new bee shall become a queen instead of a worker. It is also to be noted that the male bees or drones are hatched from eggs that are not fertilized, the queen having it in her power to lay either fertilized or unfertilized eggs. From the fertilized eggs hatch larvae which develop into queens or workers, depending on the manner of their nourishment. From the unfertilized eggs hatch the males. When several queens appear, there is much excitement in the community. Each community has normally a single one, so that when additional queens appear, some rearrangement is necessary. The rearrangement comes about first by fighting among the queens until only one of the new queens is left alive. Then the old or mother queen issues from the hive or tree, followed by many of the workers. She and her followers fly away together, finally alighting on some tree branch and massing there in a dense swarm. This is the familiar phenomenon of swarming. The swarm finally finds a new hollow tree, or in the case of the hive bee, the swarm is put into a new hive, where the bees build cells, gather food, produce young, and thus found a new community. This swarming is simply an emigration, which results in the wider distribution and in the increase of the number of the species. It is a peculiar but effective mode of distributing and perpetuating the species. The community, it is important to note, is a persistent or continuous one. The workers do not live long. The spring broods usually not over 2 or 3 months, and the fall broods not more than 6 or 8 months. But new ones are hatching while the old ones are dying, and the community as a whole always persists. The queen may live several years, perhaps as many as 5. She lays about 1 million eggs a year. The ants may fairly be regarded as the highest group of invertebrate animals. They excel in the variety and complexity of their instincts and the elaborateness of their social organization, and their abundance and wide distribution marks them as one of the most successful and dominant types produced by evolution. There are no solitary ants. All of them have a highly complex social life, live in large communities composed of males, females, and workers. The workers, sterile females, are the principal part of an ant colony. Only at the mating season do males and females appear in any considerable numbers. The workers are wingless and much smaller than the males and females. The latter are winged only for the mating or swarming season, when they leave the nest. After mating, the males die and the females or queens, throwing off their wings, proceed each to found a new colony. Aside from their mating flights, ants are all strictly terrestrial. Their nests are a maze of underground galleries and chambers tunneled out by the workers and serving as a retreat for the adults, a nursery for the young, a granary for stored up food, and in one group of ants as a vegetable garden as well. The colony consists usually of a queen ant, or in some instances several queens, whose duties are confined to egg-laying. Of a great number of workers of 2 or more castes, worker minors, worker majors, and sometimes soldiers, and at certain seasons of the winged males and females ready to issue from the nest, mate, and form new colonies. The duties of the different castes of workers vary. To the youngest and smallest ones are assigned the care of the eggs and feeding of the larvae. The larger workers forage for food, while the soldiers, large-headed and with powerful jaws, apparently do little besides protecting the nest in case of attack. Ants are primarily carnivorous. They subsist on other insects or upon sweet juices exuding from flowers, leaves, or stems, or secreted by insects. They are extremely fond of the honeydew secreted by the plant lice, or aphids, which with many of the common species forms an important part of their food. On every plant infested by aphids, one is pretty certain to see a number of ants in attendance, stimulating the excretion of the honeydew by deft stroking. Many are the stories that have been told of the curious relations between ant and aphis, but many of them need to be verified by more careful investigation. Nevertheless, it is certain that the ants do take care of their cows, as Linnaeus called them, in a way that is at least suggestive of domestication. If the various ants attending aphids on one plant are observed, they will be found to be all of one species, and apparently all from one nest. One might assume from this, but probably quite incorrectly, that aphids were considered as personal, or rather municipal, property among the ants. Again, certain ants build a sort of tent of mud or vegetable fiber over parts of branches or stems infested with aphids or scale insects, and this tent serving to protect and shelter both the ants and their cows from rain or from incursions of enemies or other ants, may fairly be regarded as a stable. Furthermore, in at least one common species of ant, the workers have been seen to take the newly hatched corn root aphids and carefully place them upon the roots of certain species of knotweed, guard and protect them there until the corn roots are sufficiently advanced, and then to remove the aphids to feed upon the corn. There can be no question that the mere presence of such bold, active, and efficient fighters as the ants must serve to keep away enemies from the slow and helpless aphids. But to what further extent the ants actively protect their charges is not so clear. The most familiar traditional aspect of ant life, the storing up of grain for a winter supply, is illustrated in the harvester or agricultural ants, whose nests are conspicuous in open grassy places and especially in arid or nearly desert regions. They bring into their nest great quantities of grain and grass seeds, and have been even credited with deliberate planting for harvest of certain kinds of grass seed, of which they are very fond. This last, however, is discredited by Wheeler. The Ecitons, or foraging ants, are fierce predatory insects, well known in West Africa and tropical America. They are nomadic, having no fixed habitations, but travel mostly by night in enormous armies which seek out and destroy every living animal in their path. The approach of these great columns strikes terror and confusion into all the varied life of the tropical forests. Beast, bird, and man hasten to get out of their path. Dwellings are promptly vacated on notice of their appearance, and they swarm through the house, seek out every cranny and crevice, attack and tear to pieces insects, mice, rats, and vermin of every kind, and retire loaded with booty to their nests, which are mere temporary camps excavated between stones or other convenient shelter. They are blind or nearly so, and traveling chiefly by night are guarded by their antennal sense, which, as in most other ants, practically takes the place of sight in higher animals. Travelers in the forest whose camps are in the line of march of an army of driver ants find themselves suddenly covered by swarms of big black insects, biting fiercely at every unprotected spot, and have to run for their lives, abandoning camp baggage and clothing for a time to the mercies of their savage assailants. Their household visitations are regarded as a blessing, for the dwelling is clear of vermin, dead or alive, when they get through with it, and a temporary eviction is a small price for the owners to pay where vermin swarm as they do in the tropics. The salbus, or leaf-cutting ants, are among the most remarkable of all the social insects. They are abundant in tropical America, and species of this group are found as far north as New Jersey. In South and Central America, they build enormous nests with vast ramifications of galleries and passages which extend for many yards and are even said to tunnel under considerable rivers. Their curious habit of cutting out little pieces of leaves and carrying them to their nests was noticed by early explorers and is referred to even in some of the Indian legends. But it was long a mystery what they did with the leaves. Ants generally are dependent for food upon other insects, animal matter, or upon sweet juices which they obtain in various ways. They do not usually eat ordinary vegetation, and while the Salvus might be supposed an exception to the rule, there was no evidence that they ate the leaf fragments which they so carefully conveyed to their homes. Professor Bates, who saw their work in the Amazon Valley, was of the opinion that they used the leaves to thatch their galleries and protect them from the heavy tropic rains. The true explanation was suggested in 1874 by Thomas Belt. The leaves are used as manure in which they grow and cultivate a peculiar species of fungus on which they feed. Within the nest, several feet below the ground, they excavate large cavities, often a foot in diameter, which are veritable underground gardens, tended, weeded, and manned by different grades of workers. The little leaf fragments are brought to these cavities, cut, crushed, and manipulated into small round pellets, and planted in the surface of the garden to serve as nutriment for the fungus to grow upon. Under the care of the ants, the fungus is not allowed to produce spores, but only to grow in thread-like filaments, from which clusters of transparent globules bud off, these latter forming the food of the ants. All other kinds of fungus growth are carefully kept down, and the temperature and moisture of the fungus garden is regulated by opening or closing the openings at the top of the nest, which seem to be chiefly ventilation holes, the ants issuing and returning by other openings more or less distant. These insects, observes Wheeler, in the fierce struggle for existence everywhere apparent in the tropics, have developed a complex group of instinctive activities which enables them to draw upon an ever-present, inexhaustible food supply through utilizing the foliage of plants as a substratum for the cultivation of edible fungi. No wonder, therefore, that having emancipated themselves from the precarious diet of other ants, which subsist on insects, the sweet exudations of plants and excrement, the Attai have become the dominant invertebrates of tropical America. The nests are guarded by large soldier workers with massive heads and powerful jaws. Smaller workers of several different sizes have assigned to them the various tasks of collecting leaves, of excavating the tunnels and galleries, of cultivating, manuring and weeding the fungus, and of feeding the young, helpless larvae, the nurse girls of the colony being the smallest and youngest of the workers. Upon leaving the nest for the foundation of a new colony, the female carries with her a small pellet of the fungus, which is carefully tended and manured until the new colony has become established. The Saba ants are not the only fungus-growing insects. Among the termites, which although not true ants, resemble them in appearance and social habits, there are certain kinds that also cultivate a species of fungus which they use for food. The worker sex, however, is said to feed upon dead wood and to receive no share of the fungus which it spends so much time in cultivating. Among the wood-boring beetles, the ambrosia beetles also cultivate and feed upon certain kinds of fungus, growing it on the walls of the galleries which they excavate. The honey ants, Myrmecocystus, are a unique group. These curious little ants store up honey like the bees, but in a very different way. Instead of building cells of wax, they store it up in the bodies of certain of the workers, in which the abdomen becomes enormously distended, so that they are veritable living casks. These individuals do not leave the nests, but are fed by the active workers, and when replete, hang from the roof of enlarged chambers in the runways. In seasons of scarcity, they are able in turn to feed the rest of the community by the same method of regurgitation. They inhabit the arid southwestern United States and were studied and described by Professor McCook from the Garden of the Gods in Colorado. Leading a rather precarious existence in a region where food is abundant only for a short season in the year, the advantage of this habit can readily be seen. And there are certain advantages about living casks in being more readily removed from danger than the fixed storehouses of the bees. A curious development of the social life of ants is seen in the so-called slave-making ants. Two of these, the sanguinary ant, or red slave maker, Formica sanguinea, and the Amazon ant, Polyergus, are well known, and their habits have been carefully studied, the most recent studies and interpretation being by Wheeler. The sanguinary ant makes raids upon the nests of other ants, but in particular upon the smaller round species Formica fusca, killing the workers, carrying off eggs and larvae to its own nest. Most of the larvae are used for food, but a part of them are reared and brought up in the nest of their captors. They become loyal members of the new community and take part in the multifarious activities of the nest, going out in search of food, caring for the eggs, feeding the larvae, excavating or extending the nest, and so on. It does not appear that they take part in the raids on other ant nests, but probably this is merely because such raids are conducted by the larger and more powerful workers only in any ant community. The resemblance here to slave-making in the human race is more superficial than real. Worker ants are never captured in these raids, and the larvae reared in the nest of the captors are not an unwilling and inferior race forcibly held in subjection and treated as an inferior caste. The nest is rather to be considered as a mixed community, in which the division of labor is based on the capabilities of the individual, but not on his race. Nevertheless, if it is considered that it is only the worker larvae of the smaller species that are reared, and that they help to rear and care for the young of an alien race instead of their own, this slave-making does involve the exploiting of the weaker for the benefit of the more powerful race. In the Amazon ant, a further development of the slave-making instinct appears, which may serve to show where the weak point lies in this method of exploitation. In this species, the workers have become largely dependent upon the captured race, not only for the care of the nest and rearing of the young, but for food as well, so that they are unable to feed or groom themselves. Under these conditions, the continuance of the Amazon ant communities obviously becomes dependent upon the prosperity and abundance of colonies of the smaller species. The slave-making race cannot prosper at the expense of the other beyond a certain limit, and its relations tend to become analogous to those of parasitic animals. In several kinds of ants, the female, instead of depending upon her own progeny to start a new colony, may seek out a small existing colony of her own, or some other species, and persuade or compel the workers to adopt her. This process has been carefully observed by Wheeler and distinguished from the slave-making habits with which it might readily be confused. Both result in mixed communities in which the larger species is more or less dependent upon the smaller in its household and personal activities. But the slave-making results from the carrying off of larvae from raided nests, the social parasitism from the adoption by an ant community of a queen of alien race. It is not wholly clear, in spite of the careful observations of Wheeler and others, how the invading queen manages to overcome the strong instinct of antagonism in the workers to an ant of another community or race. But this parasitism is carried in some species so far that the invading race has no workers, only males and females, and is wholly dependent upon its host for sustenance. There is a great variety of parasitism, social and individual, to be seen in ant communities, and the careful study of its nature has thrown much light on the nature and limits of the intelligence of these insects. There are several kinds of smaller ants that live in mixed communities with larger forms, but construct separate galleries opening into the larger galleries of their host, but too small for the larger ants to traverse. Among these, some, like the thief ant, Solenopsis, prey upon the larva and pupa of the larger form, while others merely levy toll upon the supplies brought in by the larger workers. Again, there are various insects of other orders, flies, bugs, and spiders, which make their homes in ant nests. Some are harmless or even beneficial in the life of the community, but others are ravenous and destructive, enemies of the ants, preying upon the eggs or larvae, laying their own eggs within the ant larvae to develop at their expense, and in various ways seriously interfering with the prosperity of the nest. Yet the eggs and larvae of these parasites are as carefully tended and reared by the ants as their own, and the adults are evidently tolerated by the workers, either because they are unobserved or because they are regarded as nestmates, or for some other reason still obscure. End of Section 8. Recording by Melanie Young.
Section 9 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary B. Clayton. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 6, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Zoology, Chapter 6, The Vertebrates, Fish. The vertebrates, or backboned animals, including fish, amphibia, reptiles, birds, and mammals, with man, are markedly differentiated in their plan of organization from the radiates, mollusks, or arthropods. This new plan of organization, leading to a higher plane of development, has made the vertebrate the dominant type of animal life. Not indeed in numbers of individuals or species, as some naturalists would interpret dominance, but as individually higher types, better fitted for success in the struggle for existence. They have further opened the way, in the development of man, for the inception of a new era, the Psychozoic era as it has been aptly called by Leconte, in which intellect becomes the principal